Hey guys. This is Fiction Life. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see third part what if Harry Potter returned as a legend to stop Voldemort. Here is short summary. Thrown decades into the past, a battle-hardened Harry Potter returns with knowledge, power, and a single mission: end Voldemort before he ever rises. In a world that doesn't yet know his name, the legend begins again. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Today Harry was back in the regular classroom, away from the open air and sun of the small field he'd used for his new classes. It was the day that he'd actually been rather dreading. The first time he would be dealing with the first-year students, his parents' class. Welcome to Defense Against the Dark Arts, Harry stated simply as he looked over the various children looking at him with wide eyes, Gryffindors and, thankfully, Ravenclaws. I am Professor Potter. That is the only name you will address me by. He made the statement with a pointed look at Sirius Black, who had the decency to blush and look away. Over the course of this year we will be covering a small breadth of subjects, where you will be expected to learn a number of facts, theories and spells, he stated calmly and simply as he swept his gaze over them all. I will also be assigning you to different teams for various in-class assignments. There will be one, more often than not, over the course of the year, and your participation will be counted towards your grades. When no one made any immediate comments, he nodded his head. To begin with, we'll start with the most fundamental basic of this class. What is the point? Numerous hands went up. Mr. Snape, he asked calmly as he nodded his head to the boy. To learn how to defend ourselves against the dark arts, Snape stated with a remarkably flat tone that made several of the students stifle giggles. 1 point to Ravenclaw for your cheek, Mr. Snape, Harry stated with the slightest smile on his face. Close, but not quite correct. It is called Defense Against the Dark Arts because it certainly sounds more engaging than surviving the dark arts. They stared at him and he smiled a bit more. It is a sad fact that not all people and things are equally talented in all areas, Harry stated simply as he looked at the class. And unfortunately, there are some things that are frightfully good at hurting people. My goal is simple: to teach you not how to defeat them, but how to escape them. But the protest was, of course, from James Potter. Manners, Mr. Potter. No speaking out of turn, Harry admonished James softly and shook his head before looking at the rest of the class. For those of you that know what I am called other than Professor Potter, you are probably hoping I will teach you grand and powerful spells and mysterious magics that will grant you wondrous and untold power. When he got a variety of sheepish nods of agreement, he smiled again and shook his head. Chance and circumstance allowed me to learn a specific subset of magic that I am uniquely suited to. Unfortunately, those circumstances also preclude me to being able to teach said magic. The look of disappointment on so many young faces was almost enough to melt the heart, but Harry shook his head and still smiled. However, the thing about power and magic is that it is a wonderfully multifaceted thing. You can find it in a great variety of things. Shaking his head, he smiled at them. That's the thing about magic, you can do so very much with it. That being said, he made a vague sweeping gestures. One of the things you will learn this year is how to work with others. Friends can help you out in more ways than you would believe. There was more in their eyes, including a great deal of doubt. If it wasn't for my friends, there were so many times that I would have died before I even finished school, it's not even funny. So, what you'll be learning in addition to the base curriculum is how to work together as a team. He paused a moment, his lips quirking slightly. We'll start with simple 3-person teams, from there. After they were divided up into teams, he gave each team 3 items: a soft rubber ball, a wood shield and a baseball glove. Now, anyone have an idea of what the point of this exercise is? They looked at one another before shrugging a bit. We're going to play a bit of a game, Harry stated simply and smirked at them all. You won't need your wands for this, so leave them on your desks. Each team has 3 positions. A thrower. He tossed the ball towards the wall, where it bounced before hitting one of the shields and bouncing towards the wall again. A blocker. Then he caught the ball with a glove. And a catcher. He looked at them all. The rules are simple. Only the thrower can throw the ball. Only the blocker can block it, and only the catcher can catch or retrieve the ball. The objective is simple. You follow the rules and try to hit one of your opposing teams with a ball. How does this have anything to do with magic? One student demanded with a look of angry disappointment on his face. Because if you get used to dodging balls, it becomes much easier to dodge spells, Harry stated simply. Ready to start. When the class had almost ended, Harry spoke up as he looked directly at Sirius, who was packing up his things into his bag. Now, Mr. Black, where exactly do you think you're going? To my next class. Sirius stated hopefully as he shifted about nervously. Of course, Harry agreed smoothly before gesturing to the scattered balls, shields and gloves that had been haphazardly thrown together in piles. As soon as you organize and clean up the equipment. But, couldn't you just magic it back organized? Sirius asked after a moment of confusion. Why, yes, I could, Harry agreed with a nod of his head. Why should I, though, when you already volunteered? But, I didn't. Sirius started to protest before a polite cough came behind him. I believe Professor Potter made it quite clear about his expectations after you addressed him on the train, Severus Snape stated pointedly as he looked at Sirius with half a sneer. Again during the welcoming feast. But, I didn't think he was serious. Sirius complained loudly, eyes wide. Really, Mr. Black? Harry asked with a brow arched up. Name puns on top of everything else. I wasn't, Sirius said with a blink of confusion as he mentally rewound his statement, then winced. Right, I didn't think you meant it. And now you know better, Harry stated simply with a nod of his head before looking around and seeing James staring at Lily, whose mouth was opening up to say something he guessed to be protest. And since Ms. Evans appears to want to assist, I'm sure she and Mr. Potter and Mr. Snape wouldn't mind joining you in your activities. You're mean, Lily stated with a huff as she glowered back at him. And a detention for each of you on top of it, Harry stated simply with a nod. Why am I getting dragged into this? James complained with a frown. I didn't do or say anything. All for one and one for all, Mr. Potter, Harry said in response as he smiled faintly at the boy. I did tell you that I expected better of you. And would you really leave behind your friends to suffer through things alone? But, James visibly struggled with a way to answer that before scowling. That's not fair. Imagine that, Harry agreed with a nod as Lily scowled at James. Sirius looked resigned and Severus looked, frighteningly like Sirius. I suppose that nothing I say will sway you against this? Severus asked bluntly. Would you rather leave your friend behind to deal with the two of them herself? Harry asked as he arched brow questioningly at the boy. I don't believe I should answer that. Severus noted as he glanced worriedly at Lily. I think you just did, Harry noted dryly as Lily could be seen scowling at her friend. Professor Potter, you don't have to make them stay, I'll put everything away, Sirius stated with a slight frown on his face and a look of resignation. I'll get everything put away now. You will not, Lily declared firmly as she gave Harry one last glare. If the professor is going to single you out for no reason. There was a very good reason, as you might want to recall, Ms. Evans, Harry corrected her with a faint grin. Which Mr. Black should have been quite aware of. I'm fine with him doing it himself, James volunteered easily before glancing at Snape. Severus. He is the one that put his foot in his mouth, Severus agreed with a curt nod of his head. Fine, I'm going to help, Lily declared firmly as she gave them both a glare. Even if you two won't. We're going to regret not helping if we don't, aren't we? James asked as he looked at Severus. Possibly, Severus admitted with a slow nod of his head. Definitely, Harry informed them cheerfully. Best hurry though, you're already losing time to get to your next class. Professor Potter, Dumbledore noted as he watched the last 4 students finally leave the man's class. Holding them behind for extra work. Mr. Black did volunteer his services on the Express, Harry stated simply. The rest ended up volunteering themselves to help him. So I see, Dumbledore noted with a faint frown. You do not feel you are inappropriately singling them out. I think it best to set examples so that everyone knows what is and is not acceptable, and how I will react accordingly, Harry stated with a faint shrugging of his shoulders. Of course, considering the fact that I find myself rather expecting more from those four might factor into things. I can even understand why that might be the case, Professor Potter, or, at least in the cases of Messrs. Black and Potter, but Ms. Evans and Mr. Snape. Dumbledore asked, a hint of warning in his tone. Wait, what? Harry blinked a moment as he looked back at the man in confusion about exactly what he was implying before his eyes narrowed into slits. You would not be implying that my actions had anything to do with blood status. It was not a statement so much as a warning as he glared back at the man. You do realize how it looks then? Dumbledore pressed as he gave him a level look. You are affording them no small amount of attention. Yes, Harry agreed through gritted teeth and clenched jaw. Because they were the ones that decided to slip in and take the seats in the compartment I was on in the train. Pardon. Dumbledore stated with a blink of confusion. They are a group of first years that approached and made themselves at home in the cabin on the express I was having my ride in, Harry stated with a bland irritation. They rather interrupted the nice nap I was enjoying. A nap is a terrible thing to waste, Dumbledore admitted with the faintest bit of a smile on his face. Quite. And I had to break up an argument before it could even begin, with the young Mr. Snape being quite keen on extolling the virtues of Slytherin House to try and convince Ms. Evans to join him there. Harry agreed with a sharp nod of his head. I'm sure you can imagine how that might go. Dumbledore winced slightly but shook his head. The house system would be fine, if it hadn't been corrupted by bloody asses, Harry snapped back with a grunt of displeasure. And I'm not about to let something as stupid as a Muggleborn go into the snake den with the way it is right now. Horace does a fine job of keeping them under control, Mr. Potter, Dumbledore reprimanded him quietly. With the way things have been going outside of the school, I have to wonder how much he can keep things under control, Harry countered before sighing and giving Dumbledore a helpless look. What exactly do you expect me to do? Take a chance with a new student's life like that? I had hoped that you had more trust in us to ensure that our students are taken care of, Dumbledore stated with a look of disappointment. Does it really look like I've seen enough examples of that to really believe that? Harry shot back with a sigh of irritation. I understand you're trying, but. And while there are attempts to recruit and further lines of bigotry, we are aware of them, Mr. Potter, Dumbledore stated sternly. And we are combating them. I would advise you to not allow your prejudices about certain families blind you to things. Harry bit the inside of his mouth for a moment, before taking a long, slow breath then letting it back out. I can see why you might see things that way. And if I didn't know that Voldemort has been actively infiltrating and recruiting the house through his supporters' children, I might not be so quick to advise as I did. Be that as it may, I can assure you that none of his followers are among the staff here, and that we will not stand for such actions, Dumbledore stated firmly as he gave Harry a look. And while there might be some division, I can assure you that you can be everywhere at once and monitor every student's statements even when none of you are present. Harry asked with a snort and a mild glare before sighing. Perhaps it is simply because it's been so much longer for you since you were that age, but I can quite remember how children were when I was one. And how clever they could be at making sure they only acted when there was no one else around. He paused for a moment, taking a slow, deep breath, before letting it out. Or, perhaps you've forgotten how just a look can hurt as a child. I haven't. I can't. But, either way, such an argument is moot. The hat put Ms. Evans in Gryffindor, where she has demonstrated she rightly deserves to be. Dumbledore sighed softly as he shook his head sadly. I do not know what happened to you to leave you so jaded towards those who are supposed to be responsible for your care, Mr. Potter, but we are not them. Harry snorted at that and shook his head. I think on this, we'll simply have to agree to disagree, Headmaster, because I find more similarity than difference. They too thought themselves more in control of things than they were. And they too underestimated the things that could be done when they weren't watching. I see that I won't be able to convince you of things being different, Dumbledore stated as he continued to look at Harry with a look of pity. To look at the world with eyes only able to see through the tint of your tribulations is no way to live. Funny, I was thinking about how looking at the world only through the view of what you wish to believe as truth is just as blinding, Harry shot back and shook his head. Wishing the world to be a different place does not remove its dangers. Children can very easily be those dangers. They are still children, Mr. Potter, Dumbledore stated with a narrowed gaze. Harry stared back at him unblinking before tilting his head to the side. And if they weren't capable of being a danger, then there wouldn't be a ghost in the girls' bathroom, now would there? Dumbledore actually flinched at that before his face hardened. That was hardly a fair statement. You cannot. I would be very, very careful, Headmaster, Harry stated softly as he looked back at the older man in front of him. Seeking redemption for yourself through the redemption of others will only lead you down a path to hell. And Dumbledore went absolutely still at that, his breath caught as Harry's words struck him. And from what I've seen of you, Mr. Potter, you show little interest in seeking redemption. So excuse me if I find myself taking your statements with a grain of salt. I spent most of my childhood seeking redemption for the sins I was accused of, Headmaster, Harry said after a lingering moment of silence. Because someone else wished to spare me the truth of matters because to them, I was simply a child and they saw only the child, nothing else. In my experience, no child is just a child. Nor are they monsters, Dumbledore stated firmly with an almost sharp rebuke. No, they are not, Harry agreed with a nod of his head in agreement. But that does not mean that they are incapable of being monstrous. Simply that they do not understand just what they do can inflict. Dumbledore sighed heavily and shook his head in resignation. They are still children, Mr. Potter. And how will they learn that it's wrong to be such if we don't teach them? Harry snapped back as a bit of fire hit his eyes. Actions have consequences, Headmaster. Inaction can have even more. You trust them and believe inaction will let them find the right path. I see them learning entirely different lessons. And what lessons would those be, Mr. Potter? Dumbledore asked with a narrowing gaze. That they cannot trust, or that they can hate and torment without repercussion, Harry stated with a shake of his head. That they are alone beyond their friends because the idea that another child can ostracize and drive another to despair is something that cannot happen, because the teachers say so, so there must be something wrong with them. You're exaggerating, Mr. Potter, Dumbledore stated as he shook his head. And I would kindly ask you to not bring that kind of paranoia to the students. Harry just looked at Dumbledore for a long, cold moment, his fingers clenching into his palm, before he forcibly relaxed them. Words were already on the tip of his tongue. Sharp, vicious things that he knew once said, he could not take back. Words invoking the sister that Dumbledore had long since lost. The relationship between him and Gellert Grindelwald. The greater good he had helped propose. Words that would strike at the wounds that the man in front of him had spent a lifetime trying to heal. Words that the man had no idea that Harry could wield. Instead he released the breath he held and shook his head. It is your choice to believe that, Headmaster. As I said, we will simply have to agree to disagree. If there was nothing else. Dumbledore frowned at him. That was obviously not what he had been expecting. And the issue with the students? As far as I can tell, there is none, Headmaster, Harry stated pointedly as he gave the man a long look. Unless you're trying to show favoritism and prejudice you had previously claimed to not hold. For a long moment, Dumbledore just stared back at him, eyes glinting dangerously. I had thought that after your experience with the Board of Governors you would be more amenable to compromise, Mr. Potter. Then you weren't paying attention to things, Headmaster, Harry stated softly as he shook his head. I am who I am. I take care in how far I will push my students, but I will push them. And I will not apologize for seeing that a student does not suffer needlessly when I have the opportunity to correct that. Ms. Evans hardly seems the type to need your protection, Mr. Potter, Dumbledore reminded him with a look of irritation. And you're the one that's assuming she was the one I was protecting, Harry responded with a shake of his head. Because I can assure you, Headmaster, out of all of the students present in that compartment, she was the one I was protecting the least. Explain, please, Dumbledore stated with a deepening frown. No, Harry said with a shake of his head. We've already seen where that leads us, an endless loop of going nowhere. And, unlike you, Headmaster, I can learn and change my approach to things. When he frowned and then simply left, Harry had little illusion that he had lost a good deal of the respect and leeway he'd previously been granted with the man. Though, in turn, he wasn't sure if the man had realized he had done much the same with him. He wasn't sure exactly if the man truly did not understand or was simply deluding himself by refusing to face reality. But, he hadn't grown up in the same household as Dudley Dursley. He hadn't seen the casual monstrosity that a child could be capable of, simply because they didn't understand what the problem was. And he hadn't seen what it sometimes took to make them realize exactly what they were doing. He sighed wearily and shook his head. At least the class was over with and he could move on. Hopefully the remainder of the day would not be as engaged and frustrating. Hello again. The voice behind those words made Harry groan softly as he froze stiffly in place as his hand rested on the knob of the door to his room. Ms. Black, I thought that we already had a discussion on all this. Do we really need cover it once more? I was thinking we did, Bellatrix agreed with a much more relaxed tone that he wasn't quite used to from the girl. Of course, his last two encounters could best be summarized as traumatically terrorizing her and her overly stiff attempts to get him to court her of all things. Sighing softly, Harry released the knob from his grip and slowly turned around. Then he blinked a moment. A slight tilt of his head a moment later and he was arching a brow behind his glasses. Bellatrix grinned back at him, her hands resting in a soft leather jacket over a simple black versus neck shirt with gold trim as she cocked her hips slightly to the side, showing off how the denim of her bell-bottoms clung to her hips and down her thigh. I had a feeling we could actually have a talk this time, she stated, grinning at him with an uncharacteristic predatory grin, her dark eyes sparkling. He was used to the predatory look of Bellatrix Lestrange, demented mad woman wanting to spill his blood as violently and painfully as possible. The predatory look of Bellatrix Black was the look of a woman who didn't want to spill a single drop. It was a look he vaguely remembered seeing on the faces of more than a few women over the years, though rarely with such intensity. I hope that you understand that a change in the way you dress isn't enough to make me suddenly leap forward and sweep you up into my arms and confess my eternal desire, Ms. Black, he stated evenly as he calmly crossed his arms about his chest. Well, I heard that you needed someone to help you demonstrate the practicality of Muggle outfits for defense, she stated simply as she shifted just a bit, crossing her leg across the other as she leaned back just a bit into the hallway's stone wall. And what do you know? I've learned that myself. That's also what I have your sister for, Ms. Black, Harry stated with a sign and a shake of his head. Which it sounds to me she's trying to get out of. She is, Bellatrix agreed with a nod of her head, still grinning at him. Doesn't mean that I don't want the position anyway. Sadly, I'm afraid she earned hers fairly and thoroughly, Harry stated with a tone of clearly faked regret. I'm afraid she'll just have to get used to it. And in all the classes that she's not in. She asked with a faint smirk on her lips as she pulled one hand out of her jacket and rested it on her hip. You wouldn't be planning to deprive her of her other classes, would you? No, but I would deprive her and Mr. Tonks of their snog time, he responded easily enough as he crossed his arms about his chest, which means she can make up her classes with her other teachers. That made her blink as she looked at him incredulously for a moment before sighing and shaking her head. You can't honestly expect that to work. You will find that I learned long ago that you can make even the most insane and illogical things work, if you present it properly, Harry countered calmly with a shrug of his shoulders. Wizards and witches just seem to need far less logical acrobatics to convince them. Bellatrix just stared at him, one brow fallen incredulously as she tilted her head forward. There is a limit to what people will just accept. And you keeping my sister for demonstration for every one of your classes is simply not going to be one of them. It wasn't the original plan, but what can I say? I'm good at improvising, Harry stated simply as he shrugged his shoulders. I have to thank you for giving me the push I needed to take her reward to the next level. For a moment Bellatrix stared at him with a faint frown on her lips before tilting her head slightly to the side. Can I watch then? That made him blink slightly as he focused his attention back on her. Why? Well, if you're going to do it anyway, I figured I might as well watch and see how it was done. The whole, get me to take over her punishment as an excuse to try and seduce you, idea was hers, after all, Bellatrix stated simply as she lifted and then dropped her shoulders in a shrug, making her chest shift noticeably beneath her shirt. Might as well stick around to watch the fallout. Reaching up, Harry pinched at the bridge of his nose. Why won't you just give it a rest, Ms. Black? I have already told you, I don't want to pursue a relationship with you. And last time, your reasoning was my laughable lack of knowledge of the Muggle world, Bellatrix pointed out with a shake of her head. Which, as you can see, I've rectified. You call some new clothes rectifying that? Harry asked with a look of sheer disbelief. You can't just, you. Now you're just assuming it's only clothes, she retorted, before pausing and reluctantly admitting. Though, I suppose I can't blame you for thinking that's all I thought it would take. I did, at first. That made Harry blink in surprise and arched a brow. I won't deny that you didn't have a point, she told him with a faint nod of her head. I didn't know much of anything. Not really. I only had what I'd always been told was the truth. How Muggles were beneath me, and then here you were, talking about them and placing them on a higher pedestal than witches and wizards. That isn't exactly the point I was trying to make, merely pointing out that I don't think you understand why I am so very much different from what you assume I am, he corrected with a sour mutter. I went home and almost broke down, trying to figure out how I could fix things, she continued, ignoring his muttering as she forced herself to continue her train of thought. And I found out that she wasn't as ignorant as I was. So she agreed to help me. She sighed and slumped. Then the incident happened and I was useless. Utterly and completely useless and having to rely completely on my sister and her Muggle-born boyfriend. When it was over and done with, I left Street Mungo's and had no idea what I could do with myself. Went for a walk a bit back. After everything had finished falling apart, she stated easily enough, shrugging her shoulders a bit. Was feeling sorry for myself and figured I'd mope a bit to clear my head. Then when I ended up having a talk with a bobby. It's funny what they call their Aurors, isn't it? I thought policeman was odd enough at first, then. She paused her ramblings before shrugging and sighing a bit. One thing I did learn is that, for the most part, Muggles are dreadfully peaceful. At least compared to wizards. Not quite what I was really expecting, but. Harry snorted at that. Try watching a game of rugby or football sometime and tell me that again. Did catch a game. Football, at least, she admitted with a shrug. Sorry, not much on Quidditch that. Interesting, but not enough action. And cricket was, still, there were some nice plays and movies to watch. There was a pause as she watched him stared at her in dumb-looking shock, his mouth hanging slightly. Though it's a bit sad how most of them are all about those Yank colonials. I do wonder if they're really that much more violent than we are here. Harry snorted at that. No, not more violent. Just like their bloody guns and weapons. They didn't much care for finding out that when you confiscate people's weapons, the people that still had them could and would run roughshod over them if they didn't do what they wanted. They argued with the Crown and Parliament. Crown and Parliament decided their counter-argument would be more convincing with soldiers and intimidation. It didn't work out like they thought. She frowned a bit at that. I suppose that seems a bit different. Most wizards and witches are rather lacking when it comes to taking action unless forced to. Part of what drew me to the knights to begin with. Harry's look darkened at that and she flinched back a bit, but her back straightened up and she refused to be so easily intimidated. She had seen far worse from him before, and she would not quail under such a lesser display from him now. And what draws me to you? You don't just talk. You take action, you fight, you kill, he stated flatly, his eyes flat and hard as he gave her a glare as he looked back at her with a cold, sharp glare. Well, yes, she admitted with a nod of her head and a helpless shrug of her shoulders before snorting sadly. Not like I'm ever going to be any good at fighting, though. That, he blinked a moment at that as he struggled desperately to reconcile the resigned creature in front him with the Bellatrix he'd been terrorized by as a teen. There was an air of defeat hanging around her as she leaned back onto the wall. I'm not sure exactly what you're saying, Ms. Black. She laughed, a hollow, empty sound before shaking her head a bit. I have no place on the battlefield, apparently. I am, after all, useless at it. You, Andromeda and Ted showed me that. He snorted softly at that and shook his head. Ms. Black, trying to compare me to yourself, there was a moment of silence as he paused before sighing. Do you know what the difference is between yourself and myself, your sister and her intended? There was a pause as she blinked rapidly before slowly shaking her head. You're all just better than me. Where you want to fight, where you want to prove yourself, where you seek the fight, we don't. The fight isn't what we want, but to live past it. We want to survive. And we know that to do that, we have to do whatever it takes. He slowly shook his head and sighed. I would happily live a life of peace if I could. But, confusion consumed her face as she stared at him, her mouth hanging open. Everything, you. Fighting and. I fight. I kill. I do not back down. I do not run. I claw my way through everything in my path. I kill. I steal. I lie. I destroy and ruin, he stated as he stepped towards her, his words soft, dark and sharp, because I've seen what happens when no one stands up to those that want to do those things. Because I've watched families driven to ruin, entire societies driven into despair and crushed by fear by those that want to fight, want to kill, want to see people suffer. He looked at her hard in the eye. When I see you, Ms. Black, what I see is a young woman who seems to want to become the kind of thing that I hunt. I can see the hunger to fight, to battle, to kill, in your eyes. And when you look at me, I can feel the kind of monster you think I am. She shuddered a bit under his stare and looked away, her voice breaking and stuttering. That's not true. I have seen it in your eyes, Ms. Black. I have seen that look before. And I can tell you quite simply, no matter how attractive she might be, I will not be with anyone who looks at me with such eyes. He shook his head, a sudden weariness running through him as he turned away. Now, I have a class to teach, and if you have nothing further to do here, I would suggest you leave the school grounds. With that said, he turned and quietly walked away, leaving her trembling and staring blankly ahead behind him. Bellatrix had found herself staring at a bottle of fire whiskey as she sat in a darker corner of the Three Broomsticks Inn and Pub, a goodly amount of its contents already having found the way from its mouth down into first her glass, then down her throat. Today had not gone how she'd intended. Again, she had thought she was finally making headway in everything, that she was finally going to actually make some progress with him. Instead, she found herself further back than she ever imagined she could be. She stared at the amber liquid in the glass in front of her and felt her shoulders slump down in resignation as she lifted the glass up a bit towards her lips as she could practically hear her aunt and mother's voices flitting through her mind. Calling her worthless, foolish, a blood traitor. She would sneer at the last no matter what truth might be in the rest of it. Bloody well K blood superiority as far as she was concerned. That much she had learned clearly. Bloody well K her mother and aunt for all the stupid bloody shite they had subjected her to as well. None of that mattered in the end as far as she could tell. Power wasn't about blood, wasn't about heritage, wasn't about breeding. Power was about something that she was convinced she would never really have. So she could do a few things to muggles, make them scream, hurt them, leave them helpless before she killed them. She'd have found it easy just a few months ago. Only, now when she thought about it, she thought about the policeman who'd taken the time to speak to her, to try and cheer her up. She thought about stupid, silly things like the workers she'd seen and the people at the theaters. People. Actual people. Months ago they had just been people-shaped things, less than animals, really, just there to be tortured and slaughtered. Now, though, now she had to admit, seeing them as they really were made her sick at the thought of what she'd have done before. So she certainly couldn't start making a life like she'd originally intended. Now she had to figure out what the hell she was going to do. She didn't realize she'd actually said her last thought aloud, until a silken, familiar voice hit her ear. Why, my dear Ms. Black. You come with me. Turning fearfully, she saw one burning crimson eye before a single word froze her and shattered her world. Imperio. Narcissa had watched her sister almost stumble through the halls of Hogwarts, her eyes staring vacantly forward, almost unseeing as she mechanically walked towards the exit. For a moment she had almost approached her. Almost gone to her. But something about the way she moved, something about the look in her eyes, even from the distance she had been, was enough to hold her back. It did not take much to guess what the problem was, even for her. Nor did she think that it would be too hard for her to figure out exactly what her sister was likely to go do. Sighing, she shook her head and straightened her shoulders. She would have to have words with her other sister. Is something wrong? A familiar voice suddenly asked as Narcissa almost jumped in surprise before quickly forcing face to a stony calm. Potter, she stated evenly as she saw James Potter standing there, looking at her curiously before nodding her head to his companion. Sirius. You're not answering the question, James pointed out plaintively as he crossed his arms about her chest and gave her a look. Whether or not I answer the question is my own personal prerogative, Potter, and it is none of your concern, she stated primly as she gave him a sharp look while looking slightly flustered. Well, excuse me for trying to make sure you were all right, Princess, James stated with a snort and a bit of sarcasm. I was just trying to be nice about it. Sirius groaned lightly and nudged James with his elbow. Come on, mate, don't we have enough trouble without you going and antagonizing my cousin? She's at least been decent, hasn't she? She was, James admitted with a slow nod. She's not right now, though. She's being a bit of a jerk. Please, Sirius asked again with a pleading look in his eyes. I mean, come on, my family's finally being decent. I don't want it to start going to hell with them turning back into a bunch of angry Burks. She's not exactly helping that idea, James snapped back before looking at Narcissa with all the seriousness an 11-year-old child could muster. Being upset is no reason to not comport yourself with civility and decorum. It doesn't matter what your position is compared to someone else, let them degrade themselves, you're supposed to do your best to offer compassion and consideration. He paused a moment, and then his eyes narrowed. Until they show that they will not offer you the same. When he made the statement, he stood straight, giving her a sharp look in the eye, his back ramrod and the look in his eyes one that wouldn't be easily cowed. So, what are you going to do, Black? Offer the same consideration given to you, or throw it back in my face? Sirius groaned and palmed against his face. Narcissa, however, just stared at him in silence for a long moment. Then she took a slow, deep breath and nodded her head. I apologize, Potter. I am merely worried about my sister and need to talk to Andromeda. And then it was like a switch was thrown and James with nodding his head looking sympathetic and even worried. Right then. Hope everything's alright. Anything we can do to help? Not at this moment, but I will keep you in consideration going forward, she informed him with a slow nod of her head. Good day, Potter. Sirius. She half bowed to them both before turning and making her way to search the school for her sister. Seriously, James, have you gone daft in the head? Sirius asked with an almost whining tone in his voice. I mean, come on, you know she could have hexed us 7 ways to misery, right? So, James asked as he looked back at Sirius, tilting his head to the side questioningly. What's that got to do with anything? Sirius looked at his friend for a moment before sighing and letting his shoulders slump. I'm seriously starting to see what Father meant by Potter's being utterly nutters. If you aren't willing to stand up for what you say and what you believe, what else are you going to be other than a fraud? James asked pointedly as he looked back at Sirius. I mean, sure, it's scary and stuff like that, but if I just let myself only do stuff because it didn't scare me, what would I end up being? I just want to keep my family from going back to being how we were, Sirius said quietly as he looked down. I don't want to lose this, James. You don't get how they were before. You don't understand how much different they are now. So much is different. And I don't want to lose that. And if it's something that breaks that easy, well, James started to say before pausing and shrugging his shoulders. Well, wouldn't that mean you're, gonna have to spend the rest of your life being scared and worried about breaking it? That really how you wanna live? I just wanna have my family. I finally have them and I don't wanna lose that, Sirius said as he shifted his feet around. I really don't want to lose them. Really don't. If you say so, James noted with a slight frown before shrugging. Wanna go prank those bastards that called us blood traitors? Yeah, Sirius said as he breathed a sigh of relief. That was something he could get behind, easily enough. Wanna drag Remus into it? He's not really interested in it. He wants to impress Professor Potter and be on his best behavior, James stated with a shake of his head. And he convinced Pettigrew it would be a good idea too. Guess that just leaves the 2 of us then, Sirius stated as he straightened his back and made a show of straightening his robes. More's the pity then. Oh, James looked at Sirius in confusion. Why do you say that? Because neither of us know much of anything about restraint unless family's involved, Sirius reminded him before grinning a bit. Which means we'll likely cause too much trouble without them trying to stop us. If you say so, James said with a slow nod. Not sure what trouble that'll mean for us, but, sure, if you say so. Cyrus wondered for a moment if Potters were all as absolutely nutters as James when it came to everyone outside of their family and friends, then quickly shrugged off the thought. He was technically both. So, he didn't really have much to worry about, did he? Harry was in the middle of teaching one of his third-year classes when he felt the creations he left in the cave come to life. Frowning a bit, he had paused the lesson, lifting up a hand to signal for the students to be silent as he focused on confirming he had actually felt what he thought he had. Confirming it once more, he sighed and shook his head. Is there a problem, sir? One of the braver third years asked, a hesitant tremor in their voice. No, Harry stated simply as he reluctantly pulled his attention away from the notification he had gotten. Simply an alert spell I cast some time back has been triggered. Unfortunately, it is also something that I will have to be leaving to investigate shortly. He took a deep breath then released it. So, instead of your main exercise today, I want you all to take out your books and study chapters 3 through 5. Your homework will be a 3-feet summary of the contents, 1 foot per chapter. We will have a quiz on the next class. All of them were scurrying quickly to write down the information as he gestured and the instructions appeared on the board, as well as instructions for the next class. Make sure that you take the time to think about how you can use the information as well. Class is dismissed, but those of you who wish to use this room for studying may do so. He gave them all a nod before turning and briskly walking out of the classroom towards the headmaster's office. As it happened, he found his path crossed by a still irritated Minerva McGonagall, frowning slightly but still maintaining an air of dignity. Professor Potter, I thought you had a class to teach currently. Something suddenly came up and I am on my way to discuss it with the headmaster. Harry stated simply as he gave her a brief nod of acknowledgement. Excuse me. What could possibly be so important as to lead you to abandon your students? She demanded with a glowering glare at him, while keeping pace with him. It's not particularly any of your business, he retorted flatly as he kept his voice calm and reasonable. But, if you insist on knowing, an alert ward I set up has been triggered and I need to see to it. Her face twisted into a grimace but she halted her hounding of him and gave him a slight nod of acceptance. After all, matters of security, as long as they weren't abused, were something that teachers had the right to investigate. Have you contacted the Aurors? No, Harry stated simply and shook his head. Nor do I intend to. That is highly irreg. I prefer them not be put in danger, he stated simply as he shook his head. Trying to work with people I don't know and don't know me just adds a degree of complication that puts everyone in danger. For a moment she opened her mouth to again protest before frowning a bit. Is it truly that difficult for you? He snorted at that. Professor McGonagall, I specialize in capturing and containing dark curses. I also turn them back against their casters, along with some of my more unique forms of elemental manipulation. It is very easy for someone that doesn't know how to work with me to end up hurting themselves and others because they panicked and did something stupid. She grimaced a bit at that. Do you not trust anyone then? He paused where he was, almost causing her to collide with his suddenly stiff back, before he slowly turned himself around and affixed her with a look. Professor McGonagall, I happen to have had quite a number of people I trusted. People who I knew would have my back through anything and everything. Unfortunately, all of those people are gone now. And I am not so foolish as to think that the kind of rapport that takes years to build can be built up again with complete strangers in a simple matter of moments. The unspoken ferocity in his tone made her take a step back, almost stumbling as the air of danger clawed at her. Slowly swallowing the thick bile of terror that she could feel squirming in her stomach, she reluctantly nodded her head. I see. No, you don't, Harry stated with a resigned sigh as he broke his eyes away from her and turned back towards his previous path. Now, if you will excuse me, I need to be on my way. Without waiting for her answer, he resumed his walk towards the headmaster's office, leaving her behind to consider exactly what his words meant. Narcissa eventually found her sister settled at one of the tables in the Great Hall, enjoying a free period with Ted Tonks. Steeling herself, she quickly strode over directly in her direction. She was supposed to already be in class, but family always came first. Andromeda, Narcissa said with a quiet urgency. Her hand reached out, lightly taking hold of her sister's sleeve and tugged upon it. We need to talk. What is it? Andromeda asked as she turned her attention away from Ted onto her little sister. And aren't you supposed to be in class right now? Did you convince Bellatrix to make another attempt to seduce the Professor Potter? Narcissa asked as she looked firmly into her sister's eyes, pointedly ignoring her second question. A bit, I suppose, she admitted with a slow nod of his head. I thought it would also make for a decent enough distraction from his fascination with making my life miserable. He just thinks you have plenty of talent, Rom, Ted said with a faint grin. So he pushes you a bit more, just means he thinks you can go far. I have no interest in going far in that kind of life, Andromeda stated with an almost harsh sharpness to her voice. And even less in being pushed towards it. I saw Bellatrix, Narcissa spoke up again as she looked at her sister. She did not seem particularly pleased. Or even aware of herself. She did not have the look of a woman who had managed to secure even the slightest interest in the man she desired. Oh, bollocks, Andromeda swore as she hissed out a breath. I thought. Andromeda. Narcissa hissed out as she glared, scandalized at her sister before looking at Ted with a scathing glare. This is all your fault, getting this crass and ill-thought-out behavior in her head. No, pretty sure she was like that before we got involved, Ted disagreed with a shake of his head and a look of amusement on his face. She just kept it hidden better before the whole thing about us being together came out to your family. This is not, Andromeda started to say before shaking her head. So, he rejected her again. As I said, she did not seem like a woman who had the confession of her feelings returned, Narcissa repeated as she glared at Andromeda. Why do you insist on tormenting her like this? I'm not tormenting anyone. I'm trying to help. Andromeda protested quickly. She was the one to come to me about it. Asking me for help. And did you ever consider if she actually should have that help or not? That maybe Professor Potter truly does have no interest in pursuing a relationship with her? Narcissa asked as she gave her sister a sharp glare. That you were going to hurt her. Why in Merlin's name would I think that? Andromeda asked with a frown and a look of confusion on her face. I mean, considering how she actually looks in Muggle clothes. I don't see how he wouldn't be interested. Right, far be it from me to comment on the intricacies and potential shortcomings of your line of thought, love, but, Ted noted before shaking his head. You do realize that a bloke isn't guaranteed to be interested in a bird just because she's attractive, yes? Andromeda turned and just looked at him flatly. Since when? Look, love, there are plenty of blokes that works on, yes, Ted said with a shake of his head. But, it's not a surefire guarantee. I know it might be hard to believe, but there are some men that have standards beyond just how attractive she is. Are you implying that there's something wrong with my sister? Andromeda asked as she glared back at him. You want me to quote you on just what? Ted shot back before turning his attention back to Narcissa. Sorry, but your sister has a bit of a problem with thinking fully about certain things and then overthinking overs. Narcissa slowly rubbed her forehead and glared back at Ted. Bellatrix is walking around looking like a zombie, with her dreams crushed, because you didn't think that it would be a bad for her to go and try to seduce the Hogwarts professor that has been single-handedly rearranging our family's views and singling out you to focus on. I thought. Andromeda began only to be cut off by Narcissa. Andromeda, he's the bloody storm chaser. Narcissa stated with a glare. Did you really think that it was just going to magically take care of itself? That he would see her dressed up and looking good and suddenly forget all about how they met? Yes, Andromeda admitted with a slight wince and a shake of her head. I mean, I swear, the both of you are completely nutters in different ways, Narcissa stated before slowly shaking her head and sighing as she bowed her head to Ted. My apologies. I shouldn't have accused you like that. I understand where you were coming from. I love her, but I know she can be a bit daft in the head once she gets an idea in there, Ted stated with a rueful chuckle. Trying to get it out before she causes herself a world of unpleasantness is damned near impossible. Hopefully what happened this time didn't have too much lasting damage, Narcissa stated with a sigh. I really don't want to see Bellatrix end up as deranged as Walburga. It was at that point that they saw Professor Harry Potter hurriedly along the edge of the Great Hall in a path that would lead him quickly towards the headmaster's office. Involuntarily, Narcissa shuddered as she saw the stormy expression on the man's face. I really hope that Bellatrix is all right. Is there something I can help you with, Professor Potter? Dumbledore asked with a slight frown and an arched brow. I thought you had a class too. Ward alert, was all Harry said as he nodded towards the professor's fireplace. Need to flow to Hogsmeade so I can look into it. What manner of ward alert? I was unaware you had any property, Mr. Potter. Dumbledore stated with a frown. Ward on a cave I had a feeling Voldemort would be making use of, he stated simply, shrugging his shoulders slightly. I got the alert for an all clear after he left. I need to check on it and see what he did. Or what he didn't do. Ah, I see, Dumbledore stated with a frown. Do you desire assistance? No, Harry stated simply as he shook his head and walked over to the fireplace before pausing. What's the school policy about students trying to use their families to get out of responsibilities? I'm afraid you'll have to be a bit more specific than that, Dumbledore pointed out with a slight frown before giving him a knowing look. Though, I imagine this has something to do with the Sisters Black. Just getting tired of having Bellatrix confronting me for courting. Harry stated with a sigh and a shake of his head. It's getting old. Ah, young love, Dumbledore noted with a faint smile. Perhaps you ought to give it a chance, Mr. Potter. I have. It wasn't to my liking. Harry stated bluntly before vanishing into the flow in an explosion of emerald flames. Ah, I suppose that would be a problem then, he noted with a sigh as he watched Harry vanish before pursing his lips. Though, I fail to see what the issue is. From what I can see, the two of you would make a most interesting couple. Sighing and shaking his head, he turned his attention to the paperwork in front of him. An interesting project for another time, he supposed. When there wasn't the pressing threat of a Dark Lord pressing down on things. Bellatrix knew next to nothing. She existed, floating in a pleasant fog that didn't have the unpleasant realities of her life. Instead, she enjoyed the warm, soothing sensation of doing nothing but what she was told to. Well, my lord, you have captured one of the blood traitors, what do you plan to do with her? A voice commented, not that she really felt like paying attention to them. She had more important things to do, like enjoying the cloud she drifted on. Be silent, fool, Crucio. A part of her wanted to giggle at that. She vaguely recalled the spell, one that she'd been hoping to learn how to cast, to master. That had been a long time ago, hadn't it? The screams around her mattered little to her. She just had to stand there, enjoying the feeling that permeated her body. That was nice. Tilting her head to the side, she frowned just slightly. Or was it? She remembered that the storm chaser didn't like that about her. How she thought it would be fun to be dangerous, dark, destructive. Should she really be just standing her letting all this happen? Damnatable little wench. Imperio. And instantly all her thoughts and worries went away. That was nice. Nothing to think about once more. My lord, I apologize, but if she's going to be so difficult to keep under, shouldn't we just? You wouldn't be implying I'm having difficulties controlling one blood traitor, now would you, Avery? No, my lord, I would never. Crucio. The screams started up again then. They weren't very nice, she decided. Too shrill and pleading. Did they always sound that way? She remembered how she sounded when she screamed herself before the storm chaser. She didn't particularly like that sound, either. Now that was she thinking something again? Get out of those worthless muggle scraps you call clothes, you little wretch. She blinked a moment before realizing that the order was for her. Slowly, mechanically, she removed things. First the shirt, then the jeans. A moment later the brassiere and the clothes until she was standing there. Now burn them and go put on your uniform for tonight. His voice was sneering and acidic as it commanded her to action. But that didn't bother her. She just needed to do as she was told. Nothing else really mattered. Soon the clothes burst into flame and she watched them for a moment, almost feeling something, but it was too faint, too weak, to make an impression. Then she moved as she had been told. It was so much easier to just do as she was told and ignore her own wants and expectations. A part of her mind noted that the uniform couldn't really even be called a robe. A brief, thin material of transparent silk that looked almost black when it layered together, and trimmed with black lace. It was almost traditional in its appearance. Now, the collar and the cuffs. Obediently she did as she was told, slipping on the collar she had been supplied, and then the cuffs. Almost as soon as she'd done so, she could feel the way the cuffs snapped her arms behind her back, and the collar forced her to arch back, thrusting out her chest in the process. As she stared up towards the ceiling, she noted the grain of the wood ceiling, studying the lines with a bored emptiness. They were there, and she had nothing else to do until she was commanded again. Good, he stated with a sharp nod of his head. Come along. Everyone should be arriving now. He grabbed hold of her by the back of her hair and suddenly she could feel herself being violently torn through the sensation of forced apparition. They were in a cave. With a lake. An ornate wood platform stood around a solitary island in the center, with ornate silver snakes curling down. Hanging emerald banners hung around the cave's roof. Go, stand, he stated simply with his voice once more aloof and in control. She didn't need to be told where she was supposed to go. The small platform raised up in front of the only rock jutting out of the island was the obvious answer as she walked to it and then stood there silently. Then suddenly the air twisted and rent as black-clad forms spilled out, arriving in sudden clumps in groups of 3 to 5. All of them with their eyes behind stylish silver masks, watching her with eyes made of empty shadows. It was like being stared at by statues of puppets. Welcome to you all, he said, addressing them from where he stood in front of the assembled figures, his head tilted to the side and his entire posture radiating power and control. There have been those among you that have fallen prey to doubts and whispers. Thoughts that perhaps I am not whom I claim to be. That I am somehow wanting. He paused, letting the word roll off his lips as if the syllables themselves were a fetid rot. I have found your lack of faith disturbing. A grand gesture and, from the edges of the lake, a rolling flame erupted, spreading with a sinuous, undulating motion as it turned into a slowly uncoiling snake that hissed as it circled the edge of the water. In fact, I would almost call it disheartening. To think that a bunch of muggle-loving fools would be able to vanquish Voldemort. He roared the last word as the head of the snake rose up behind him, looming over Bellatrix and Voldemort, staring down at the assembled knights of Walpurgis, its body flaring so wildly, it was almost as if it had developed flaming feathers. Then he seemed to calm down, though his crimson eye still burned with a hungering menace. But, I understand. You were weak. You gave into the temptation of fear. You allowed doubt to cloud your judgment. There was a pause before he affixed one figure in particular with a look. Most of you, however craven your doubts had made you, did not allow it to dull your thoughts and leave you prone to a most foolish mistake. Most of you did not make the mistake of thinking I would be so weak, so foolish, as to not notice the way they had gone crawling to others to try and curry their favor in return for my secrets. He gestured languidly towards a single figure and suddenly everyone else around it was pushed away. Honestly, Johnston, your betrayal alone was bad enough, but for you to think that I wouldn't notice it and that you were safe to come back after your little trip to the ministry. My lord, I did nothing of the sort. I was only there to deal with a fine my father received. They say he was muggle baiting. There was a cringing, whimpering desperation in the voice as it struggled visibly against some kind of bonds holding him in place. Muggle baiting. Honestly, Johnston. That was the best you could do. He sneered as his eyes locked on the mask and suddenly the shadows covering their eyes fled them, revealing terrified hazel orbs. Did you really think a mind as weak as yours could deny me? Could hide your sins from me? I can see the truth of it all those traitorous thoughts, dancing about in your small little mind. Then he turned and gestured grandly around the room. So, here, my friends, we have a foolish little traitor among your ranks. A craven little coward that thought himself clever as he went crawling to the pathetic little wretches at the ministry for protection. And what's more, he thought he could keep it hidden from me. Even as he stands here, wearing the same mask and robes as you did, only he has soiled his beyond redemption. There was a pause there as he let the words hang in the air and savored the look of panicked, animalistic terror in his prey's eyes. So, alas, I'm afraid I have no other choice. Measures must be taken, as all of you know. Our honor must still be maintained. The words were said with a note of sadness that didn't reach his eyes, and suddenly the snake leapt forward and the traitor only screamed a short amount of time before dying into a whimpering gurgle as his flesh blackened and his body contracted, hunching involuntarily forward as his flesh burned and his muscles contracted. When nothing was left but charred, greasy flesh, the serpent withdrew, leaving a wretched figure in its wake, a corpse horrifyingly disfigured, with just enough black, charred flesh left on its frame to resemble a man. Only to have Voldemort take it a step further. A gesture and a sickly spell shot out, wrapping itself about the figure with a nauseating glow. But, even in death and dishonor, there are still uses for such a creature, Voldemort noted idly as it straightened and stood on poorly angled legs, arms curled back against its body as its head hung limp and broken to the side. After all, why make such a thing even more of a waste? And then the burned Inferni turned and stumbled into the water of the lake, falling down and into its depths and vanishing from sight with an unnatural speed. But, for the rest of you, he turned and smiled at them, a sharp, vicious thing that made them all shift nervously about. For all your doubts, you did not falter and did not flee. So, I have a reward for you. I welcome you all to where I first realized my role in this world, where I first started on my path of cleansing away the mud and the filth, where first had the pleasure of ending one of their worthless lives. They all looked both eager and worried as suddenly they could feel a tingle of magic slamming into place as wards went up all around the cave. For the duration of this evening's festivities, no one will be suddenly appearing in, no one will be leaving. Tonight, to each of you I give a piece of my own vengeance. He stepped aside, gesturing towards Bellatrix with a cold, jagged smile. You can have everything of her except her life. He gestured then once more and suddenly the fog over Bellatrix's mind lifted, returning her to her faculties. But, no need to deny her the enjoyment of the experience, now is there. And suddenly, it was like a switch had been flicked, and the pleasant haze of the imperious curse withdrew, leaving her suddenly aware of her surroundings and her situation, standing half naked in front of a group of masked knights of Walpurgis, bound and helpless without her wand. In a place where she didn't know where she was. Trapped under magics she had no comprehension of. She shook away the last fogging clouds that remained of the spell and then beeped in a sharp breath as the reality of her situation sank in. There we go. Now she has some fight in her again, Voldemort noted with a drawl as he gestured, and an onyx throne appeared at the back of the island where he took a seat, the burning serpent looming menacingly above him. I do expect all of you can do something about that. It was then she realized exactly what they planned to do to her when the first figure advanced on her. No. Oh, shut up you blood traitor bitch. One of them spoke up, his wand slashing up as a sickly yellow length of magic snapped out and grabbed hold of her collared throat. And get on your knees where you belong. She could smell the leather of the collar burning, an acrid, greasy smoke that burned at her nose as she was suddenly pulled forward, slamming her down onto knees as she felt the first sharp pain of her knees hitting solid stone with only a thin piece of silk to cushion her. Then she felt a sudden sharp twist of her hair being grabbed, pulled tight and vicious. With a hiss of breath, she felt how she was forced to arch back, to stare up at the silver-clad face even as she struggled against the grip. You disgusting little harlot. She froze at the voice. The words mattered little, they never had, but she recognized the voice itself instantly. Walburga. You ruined everything. Then she felt the back-handed slap across her face as her flesh scratched and tore from the few scant rings the woman still kept. You cost me my family, my history, my dignity, my legacy. All because you wanted to be a panting little bitch for some dirty, half-blood mongrel. Bellatrix could feel the stinging slap once, then once more before something hot and wet splashed on her face, her aunt's spittle, before her face was thrown down almost stronger than she could resist. You should be grateful that you'll at least have something to offer your betters before your worthless life is ended. Even if it's to relieve themselves of their frustrations. She could hear the sneer in that voice, sharper, uglier than she remembered. Even if they're just going to waste their seed on your worthless body. Then she could feel her aunt's face replaced by another, stronger, larger hand, and she was suddenly forced face down into the ground as her hips unconsciously rose, her body not flexible enough to curl down completely. Well, that's a bit much. Maybe some of the more desperate will have a go, but some of us can enjoy ourselves in a much less demeaning way. And then she screamed as the curling shock of pain wrought up her spine, leaving her clawing, spasming in the air. Like that. Not quite like a crucio. It doesn't make your entire body just sing like the cruciatus, but it leaves such a wonderful spread of sweet, raw flesh. She could feel the tip of his wand then, pressing into her, tracing over her flesh like nothing, before suddenly hitting one particular patch, and it again exploded in pain. We developed it after noticing the effects of a particular magical beast that liked to make its victims suffer an excruciating fate before they died. I've always wondered, though, what would happen if someone decided to flay skin like this? Well now, why don't we find out? Bellatrix endured it, for a time, fighting down the tears, trying to give them as few screams as she could. But she could only last for so long before she finally couldn't help but scream, and scream, and scream. Harry hadn't been in any particular hurry as he made his way through his secret tunnel. Voldemort had hardly done much to the cave beyond the inferni that he had stalked and the poison hiding the locket last time. And the poison, he knew, came after Sirius and Regulus were much older. He did, however, note subtle tingling of magic as he approached, and frowned slightly. That was not what he was expecting. A quick check made him even more confused. Anti-apparition and portkey wards. Why in Merlin's name would he have those up? He frowned and closed his eyes as he extended his will out to the stone ahead of him, and assured himself that, yes, they were still there, ready to go to work. Which meant that there was another reason for those wards to be up. A feeling hit his stomach, a dark, sinking feeling that promised no small amount of horrible, horrible things ahead. He had already thrown everything that would be to the wind with his actions so far. Was this part of the fallout of his actions? Had Voldemort merely used the cave for other purposes that he'd never learned about? What reason would he have had to erect wards preventing anyone from leaving? Too many questions. Too many things it could be. Too many horrible thoughts he didn't to contemplate. But he needed to know what he was going to face before he did anything. So he willed a number of his creations to break away, peeling back from the wall, until only a thin layer remained. A thin layer that did not stop the faint sounds of screaming from reaching his ears. Fighting down the urge to immediately rush in, he had a small piece of stone at eye height pull away from the wall so he could see inside. When he did, what he found made his blood boil. It started with a rumbling crack, missed by the participants in Voldemort's little party as they focused on the sobbing screams that rose out of their victim. The stone shifted slowly, piece by piece as jagged edges rose up around the edge of the lake. They twitched, violent and chaotic, like a reflexive impulse of fingers wanting desperately to catch hold of something and simply begin to squeeze. A warning that they didn't notice. The only warning they'd get. Suddenly it exploded, an explosive rush of vicious stone figures, all made of jaggedly broken rock and crystal that sang with an angry scraping and grinding that set ripped through the air. In an instant they all turned, their faces wide with shock, disbelief, and a sudden look of wide-eyed terror. They could see a banished wave of jagged tips of stone blasting into them with just enough time to instinctively try and apparate away or throw up half-formed shields to protect themselves. Wards slammed into them as they tried to force themselves away, slamming back into the paths of stone shards that drove into their flesh like spikes, as the force behind them pulverized flesh and bone. Poorly raised shields buckled and broke, glowing bits of magic that melted as much as they shattered beneath the sudden assault. In an instant, an entire line of the masked figures had been reduced to broken, screaming wretches and the gurgling dead. Their bodies began to shake and convulse, and one particularly unlucky wizard had just enough time to fall on his ass before 7 stones shot out of the body in front of him and thick rocky slabs smashed his leg between them as they formed a blood-spattered arm. Sharp splashes of blood erupted out of the figures as the survivors were treated to the sight of a stone hulk forming itself from the broken bodies of their comrades. Just as they raised their wands to it, it suddenly swung the leg it held, and the helpless knight attached to it, in a powerful arc that slammed away 5 of them into the lake around them. It rose up, holding the now limp figure in its hand, and loomed over them, dripping with blood and sinew. Then suddenly a great serpent of flame was coiling around it, ignoring the way it consumed the giant's makeshift weapon, and squeezed tightly together. Hot, molten stone began to bubble and fall, making hissing drops of steam bubble and pop as it bit again and again at the jagged rock. Around them, the wizards looked horrified as the scent of burning flesh and boiling blood filled their noses. Did you think that I would be so easily defeated by the same tricks again? Voldemort's voice spoke up, echoing in fury as all around them, shambling monsters of stone and crystal dove down into the lake, vanishing into the inky darkness as the cave grew and grew in size. Your elemental parlor tricks mean nothing to me. I will break your precious stone toys. The snake suddenly squeezed sharply and a violent crack made the stone giant shatter and break as it fell into a pile of half-melted stone. I will melt your pathetic little pets. He threw spells at the leaping stone forms, and they suddenly vibrated to red hot in midair before turning into shapeless molten hunks that exploded into steam when they hit the water's surface. I will crush everything you care about, everything you hold dear. He snarled as he slashed his wand down, and suddenly entire chunks of the cave's roof fell down like they'd been shot out of a cannon and smashed everything beneath them. And when I'm finished, I will burn. The word was spat out with so much emotion, so much pure, unadulterated hate, that for a moment, Voldemort physically flinched before the air around him warped and wroth as the air around him burst into a vicious mix of flame and concussive force that sent him flying. And with that Harry stepped forward from the shadows behind where Voldemort had been standing and he banished the man's throne straight into the first knight of Walpurgis to raise their wand towards him, throwing the figure straight into the angry, burning snake had been slowly uncoiling from the mess that had been his giant. In one slashing sweep he gestured, his wand glowing so brightly it seemed on fire as reflexively his enemies dove in a blind panic to escape whatever he'd been casting. Only there was no spell fire. No conjuration, no charm, nothing that came even remotely close to them. A familiar, angry, maddened voice suddenly cackled out. What? All out of magic already, you mud-blooded son of a WH. Walburga Black's words cut off as a flick of his wand sent a concentrated blast of air the size of a woman's fist straight into her chest, one that hit so hard that her sternum was instantly powdered before it spread out, grabbing hold of the rest of her body and smashing it all the way across the room to pulverize against the jagged rocks sticking out of the wall. As he seemed to ignore the way that he could see Voldemort angrily rising up out of the water he'd been thrown into, his robe destroyed, hanging off of the man's body in ragged, half-incinerated tatters, revealing pink and burned flesh beneath, Harry spoke. For those of you too stupid to pay attention, no, I am not out of magic. He raised a wall of crystals from the floor beneath him to stand between himself and the sudden jagged spikes of ice that Voldemort had thrown at him from the lake, dully noting that they held only a few seconds before crashing and shattering as he stepped out of the way. But, now you've got nowhere to run to. The sheer arrogance of the brat in front of him made Voldemort's blood boil as he snarled back at him. This is where you die, Potter. Harry simply tilted his head to the side as he looked back him. This will be your eternity, Riddle. It was the name that was the last straw as he could feel the throbbing pulse of magic in his eye. An eerie, bloody glow suddenly filled the air as his crimson eye suddenly turned into a solid crimson. Without even a moment's hesitation he grabbed hold of one of his wounded followers and slashed his throat, with the tip of his wand glowing in time with the pulsing of his eye. He let his wand soak in the spread of blood before shoving away the dying knight, ignoring the desperate, terrified gurgles that came from him and stepping over his struggling body. With a snap of his wrist, he sent a splattering of the blood towards the pile of bleeding corpses. Then he ripped his wand back and suddenly an eruption of blood ripped away from the bodies, both dead and those still struggling to hold on to their lives. Harry's eyes widened at the display before immediately slabs of stone and crystal rose up, pillars that suddenly slammed into the roof of the cave, and obscuring himself from direct sight by the forest of the stone and crystal pillars. It made him laugh, a dark, rumbling thing as he flicked his wrist and a lash of blood cracked and shattered one of the pillars with one motion, sending it flying. Did you really think I wouldn't be ready for you? That I would fall for the same tricks? A twist of his wand and the blood began to spin, drilling through one pillar and then the next, cracking, shattering into broken chunks that scattered everywhere. I studied our little duel, Storm Chaser. All your little tricks, impressive as they might seem, are just that, tricks. Now I will show you real magic. Only, when the dust and rubble settled, his opponent had vanished from sight. Snarling, he gestured with his hand and his serpent slithered into the broken stone and crystal, turning it all into a melted mess of hissing, breaking stone. Only, suddenly it rose up like a great pair of jaws and consumed half of the serpent's body before pulling it back down into the floor. You call it real magic. I just call it a fetish. Harry's voice drifted through the air around him, and he snarled in response. More paltry little parlor tricks, he stated, growling as he raised his wand, and the drilling coil of blood solidified into a floating orb, hovering over the bodies of the first wave of dead. Then the ns of the wounded rose into the air before becoming panicked cries as the orb called to their blood, pulling it from them bodies from everywhere it could be found in the room. Can you feel it, little Storm Chaser? The way it pulls at you, the blood in your veins. The way it slows down, pulling at you. He hissed out the words with a smile, listening to the sudden shouts of panic from the surviving knights of Walpurgis as they too felt the magic. Blood calls to blood. I used to think that meant something far more familial. Only, when you get down to it, it's far more primal, far more visceral, he purred out, as he watched one of the knights, his mask knocked away, fall to the ground, his face purpling from the pressure of the blood rushing up to it. Blood calls to blood and it makes it so very easy to exploit, wouldn't you agree? Then blood burst out of the noses of the wizards, out of their ears, their eyes, flowing into the air, flowing in drops, then streams as the bloody almost exploded out of their heads and wounds, feeding into the swirling, pulsing orb in the middle of the cave. Seen it. Fought it. Beat it. Harry's voice snapped back almost boredly. Not to mention, you used it wrong. Instantly the orb spiked out, sending stabbing tendrils into every little inch of the cave, into every shadow, every corner, everything that it could find. No, I don't think so, Voldemort stated with a smug curl to his lips as he stood there, surrounded by rigid tendrils jutting out like spears outlining his body. You're entitled to think whatever you want, Harry's voice countered back. Harry recognized the spell as soon as Voldemort had flicked it into the group of bodies. His response had been swift and immediate as the ground beneath his feet flooded with his magic, spreading into the stone and crystal beneath and before him with alarming speed. Speed fueled by the sudden, raw terror that spread with a glacial chill through his veins. Even as the first swell of blood began to take shape, he had a dozen pillars up, with more rising. Then he was gone, running as fast as he could away from where he'd been standing. He recognized that spell and he knew what it could do. He remembered a day in Sudan, working through a muggy swampland with his team, a brave handful of locals helping guide them towards the home of a local Dark Lord who had been terrorizing the village populaces. He remembered the way buzzing insects had approached them, again and again. The way the locals had looked at the small little things with a terror, like they were watching the darkest of wizards plying their trade. And he remembered the sheer squealing terror one of them had let off when he slapped his neck and then saw a small patch of fresh blood. The man's friends had banished him a few dozens of yards away as soon as they'd seen it. Their own eyes filled with a horrified determination as they grabbed hold of Harry and his team and pulled them away. They hadn't understood it at first, had argued against it. Then the man had started to scream. Horrible, wet sounds as his face grew bulged and bloated and a fine red mist had started to spray out of the tiny pin prick left that had been left on his skin. And then it had poured back down on the man's flesh, eating away at the flesh of his throat like a giant crimson pustule. Surging in size as the man's flesh had grown pale, his body faltering, falling to his knees in the muck. Then his entire throat had exploded, sending flying droplets of blood in every direction. Harry had watched as every animal they touched suddenly began to twitch and convulse and bleed. It had been a horrible chain reaction that had thankfully been contained by the locals' quick actions. The Blood Gorger. A spell that had been used to slaughter entire villages in tough, agonizing minutes as every living thing with blood in its veins it could touch was used to try and infect others. A curse that was considered vile and horrible on a level beyond even the unforgivable to those few who knew of its existence. And Voldemort was apparently one of the few who not only knew of it, but had no qualms about actually using it. He only had moments. The second stage of the Blood Gorger, while less overtly terrifying, was still more than most people would think possible. The blood fueled the magic controlling it. It turned it into a horrible weapon that could tear through almost any defense with impunity if it had enough blood to draw upon. And then he remembered Bellatrix. Hissing in anger, he glanced around and found her staring dumbly ahead at the wall where he'd toughly half-splattered her aunt. A part of him wanted to just leave her there, to let her die so that he could then focus on Voldemort. Only, that niggling little whisper in the back of his mind wouldn't let him. He grabbed hold of her as he pulled them both to the edge of the lake and into the water as he heard the sound of stone and crystal cracking behind them, a bubble of air forming around them as they sank down into the depths. They were caught by several of the constructs he had animated before, the ones that had been pulling the Knights of Walpurgis that had been thrown into the lake down beneath the surface. A quick motion and the side of the small island indented, forming a cave inside the cave as he hollowed it out and created a ledge large enough for two people. It was there he left the still shocked Bellatrix as he focused his attention on the world above them. A deep breath was taken and he focused, letting his magic reach out past the earth and the stone back into the main cave. Tricks. Now I will show you real magic. He missed out on whatever else the dark wizard had said and he twitched slightly before focusing his attention and responding with words that echoed through the air itself. So he responded by turning his stone and crystal, the burning slag and molten earth onto the flame serpent, beeping it down into the sluggish, bubbling stone. Then there was the banter, back and forth. A moment later he could feel the magic suffusing everything, pulling at the blood in his very veins. Next to him Bellatrix gasped in fear as she felt much the same, her eyes regaining a bit of their light as renewed fear broke through her veins. The pressure was building. Cursing softly, he gestured with his wand, forcing on blocking the pull. Lessening the pressure. Keeping their blood in their veins. Then the spears had hit every inch of the earth, digging into the lake, trying to kill everything there. It was just the three of them now. Voldemort had seen to that. And Harry had to respond. When he pulled the spears back, preparing for another strike, he launched the still red-hot, melted rock straight the floating orb of blood and swept it down into itself, sending a splashing wave in Voldemort's direction. Snarling in anger and frustration, Voldemort pulled his wand back and an explosion of steaming black burst out of the rapidly cooling stone. A twist of his wand and a bright crimson orb the size of a fist exploded out of a black charred shell, steaming thickly in the air as its surface roiled and twisted like a curled sludge. Harry pulled his senses back at that and then gave Bellatrix a look. Stay here. As she just stared at him with wide eye, trying desperately to keep her breath under control. He gave her one last look before dropping back into the water. Harry rose up out of the water with a bubbling roil as he stood on a walking collection of broken stone while Voldemort glared balefully at him. More parlor tricks, Potter. The voice echoed the angry sneer curled up on Voldemort's face as he stood there, dressed in half-burnt robes and radiating a burning menace. Just a couple more. Riddle, Harry stated back with a sharp glare that was razor-sharp. And he just needed to finish this one more time. Then let's see how well you can perform your tricks without your tools, magician. Voldemort hissed before he invoked a wave of mass transfiguration on a scale that Harry had only heard tales of. Every inch of stone and crystal surface in the entire cave suddenly wavered and then splashed into the lake down to 3 feet from the surface. Harry's eyes widened as his construct splashed down into the water, leaving him submerged up to his knees. In front of him Voldemort hovered, his lower body a mass of black mist, his lips curled back into a smug, superior sneer. What now? Where are your tricks now, oh Storm Chaser? Harry looked back at him, glaring sullenly at the man who had destroyed his childhood, before suddenly the water swirled around him, faster and faster as it leapt into the air, blasting away from his body as slowly he rose up into the air. Glaring back at his opponent, he cracked his neck to one side and then the other as he floated there at the same level as Voldemort. Congratulations, Voldemort. You've managed to push me farther than anyone has in quite some time. Harry stated with a slight nod of grudging acknowledgement. Voldemort's eyes were flat and disbelieving as his smug sneer had broken into a snarl. You have me at a disadvantage, Harry acknowledged with a nod of his head. But. And Voldemort wasted no more time, refusing to be baited into a distraction. Spells were thrown out, a stream of action designed to box Harry in, to trap him in place as he sent an explosion to the roof of the cave above him. A box to try and force Harry into a compromising position. Only Harry rushed straight at him as a wave of water tore in either direction, as a plow of air sent it to either side. Voldemort's eyes widened and reflexively floated backwards, trying to keep distance between himself and Harry. His wand raised up, its tip glowing a sickly green as he reflexively cast what was his signature spell. Avada Kedavra. It leapt free of his wand, its form becoming a translucent skull, jaws gaping wide and hungry, as it sped towards Harry. The killing curse was followed by one, then another, each of them racing at a slightly different angle, as if trying to anticipate just where Harry would dodge. Instead, Harry dropped into the water, vanishing beneath the black surface. Voldemort shifted uneasily, swaying from place to place as he floated above surface. The dim, flickering lights couldn't reach more than a few feet into the water. Everywhere he looked, he saw the same, of rippling black surface still swaying from Harry's dive. Where are you? Do you think you can hide? Foolish boy, let us see what happens when your own little tricks I turned against you. He declared, his wand raising towards the roof of the cave, then twisting into a slow half-circle, before viciously striking down towards the water. Hundreds, thousands, of stalactites formed on the roof of the cave, then shot down like a rain of arrows, piercing the water wherever they could. Voldemort laughed, a harsh, vicious thing that scraped through the air. He then slashed across the air. Beneath him, the water exploded. For a moment there was nothing, just the sound of splashing waves and crumbling rock falling into the water. Then the air began to hum, a low note that slowly rose. Higher and higher it rose. Voldemort could feel it in his teeth and in his bones. He clenched his jaw tightly and gestured with his wand. And suddenly he was in silence. The hum in the air no longer shaking his flesh. The sound of the water falling muted. Then suddenly the air in front of him distorted, bending backwards into a sphere, before exploding. He barely had the time to react, flying backwards as he raised a shield. It still threw him out of control as his body crashed into the hard stone wall. Harry rose out of the water then, faint traces of blood dripping down his skin, his clothes in tatters. Around him the air twisted into spirals. Voldemort could see it coiling, pulsing, drawing back its strength. He slashed an arc into the water in front of him, sending up a spray which suddenly froze into an icy wall. He only had a moment to slide away before it cracked and shattered from an impact as boring drills of air pierced through it and into the wall. With a hiss of anger he banished the shots of stone and ice back at Harry. Air in front of Harry had barely begun to distort when he screamed, and suddenly the shots exploded with a horrifying force. Harry's eyes widened and he let out a hiss of pain as he was propelled back, skidding across the water surface. Only he twisted around, his boots digging into the water, digging a valley of waves in their passing. Then he shot forth, cannonballing towards Voldemort as he sent scything blades of distorted air spinning at his opponent. He didn't even wait for the blades to hit or miss as suddenly a plume of flame burst at his heels, and a trail of fire lit across the water. Voldemort had two of the blades stopped by a barrier of ice, but the rest shattered it as he sent a wave of darkness that spread like ink over the water. Where it touched the blades, they shuddered and ground to a halt. Sweat dripping off of his face, he glared balefully at Harry. The flames coursing behind Harry suddenly erupted. They rose out, surrounding him, wreathing in a hungry shell. He did not slow. He did not flinch. In front of him Voldemort waited, knowing he would dodge. Wand raised, he held it ready, waiting. He would end this fight now. Only, Harry had other plans. There was no spellfire. There was no curse, no hex. There wasn't even a jinx. Voldemort only had a moment to realize Harry intended something far different than what he expected. Reflexively he tried to banish him away. The tip of his wand began to glow that killing curse green. Instead Harry's fist, cloaked in flame, smashed into him. It knocked him back as he could feel the crackling burn of the fires digging into his skin. He couldn't even hear the sound of his own momentary scream, but it echoed all throughout the cave. Desperately he blasted a wave of unfocused explosive magic at Harry, knocking him away. The sizzling hiss of boiling water surrounded Harry as he sank for a moment. Then, with a shake of his head, he rose up. He looked at Voldemort and his lips curled in a snarl. You know, I actually thought that you, with all of the nightmares you've given, wouldn't have lasted this long. I didn't think you could push me this hard. Not anymore, he said the words bitterly. Not that Voldemort heard him. The man realized Harry was saying something and he grit his teeth as he banished the silencing spell from him. As he spit out a mix of saliva and blood, he glared at Harry. What are you? Me. Harry barked off a bitter laugh. I'm an unfortunate soul who was always in the wrong place at the wrong time. All because pair of old men listened to the ramblings of a mad woman and took the words as gospel. He paused there, tilting his head to the side, staring at Voldemort for a moment. So, the King of Serpents bit me. A phoenix cried for me. I died and rose again. You call me a magician. You say I just use tricks. My blood is the earth. My heart is the flame. And my soul is the wind. None of that matters. You are only mortal. Voldemort spat back. You think that you can strike me down. You think that you can kill me. Death has no hold over me. Then he began to laugh, a vicious, taunting thing. I am an immortal. I shall never die. Harry tilted his head to the side and then shrugged. The ultimate plan was 7, wasn't it? Voldemort froze at the words, staring at Harry in horror before rallying himself again and glaring back. You know nothing. A diary. A ring. A diadem. A cup, he said, each word causing with a vicious smirk on his lips to grow. A locket. Haven't quite decided on the last, have you? A look of sheer terror crossed Voldemort's face. Impossible. You can't. They are safe. Well, the diary, the cup, and the locket are, Harry stated with a bemused smile. The ring and the diadem. Sorry. Oh, and the basilisk in the chamber joined them. For a moment Voldemort stared at him in horror before his face firmed and he glared back at Harry. No matter. As long as the others remain, I am still immortal. Yes, you are, Harry agreed, only the vicious smile on his face relayed far more sinister intention. I never wanted to hunt them all. I never needed to destroy them all. I already destroyed the ones that mattered. Voldemort took a deep slow breath and then glared at Harry. Then, you have already tipped your hand. You cannot stop me. I cannot kill you. I can stop you. There is a difference, Harry stated as he summoned forth a ball flame and narrowed his eyes at Voldemort. Lucky me, that means I just have to destroy your body. Voldemort responded by hissing back at Harry before a giant snake of water suddenly formed around him. I will enjoy stripping the flesh from your bones and leaving your skull at the bottom of my chamber pot. The ball of fire in Harry's hand morphed into a phoenix, the air rippling with its cry as it suddenly began to fly around Harry's form. In response to Voldemort's claim, Harry merely arched a brow. And then he simply gestured for Voldemort to come and take it. And, like lightning, the serpent struck, snapping out into the distance between him and Harry, mouth opened wide with glistening wet fangs. In response the phoenix swelled up in size, letting loose a great cry. From its mouth roared out a spear of flame. It flew true and sure. Instead of being skewered by it, the snake rippled and twisted around it, coiling along its length and shattering the flames with a hiss of steam. Still, it came. And the phoenix rose up with outstretched talons and caught the snake in its grip. They twisted and turned, fighting for dominance. One trying to smother, the other trying to boil away into nothing. And, as they fought, then masters were not idle. Voldemort flew to the side, trying to flank Harry. Harry retaliated by sending wave after wave of air rolling at him. They made him twist and turn, but they did not deter him. A barrage of killing curses left his wand, streaming towards Harry. Strategy and variety were thrown out the window in favor of flying death. He no longer wanted to play. He no longer wanted to prove his superiority. Now all he wanted was for Harry to die. Harry responded by flying through the air, leading Voldemort on a chase through the cave. Suddenly a distorting sphere appeared between him and Voldemort, hanging in the air. Voldemort tried to steer around it, only Harry shot a burst of flames into it and it detonated with vicious force. Thrown flying again, Voldemort snarled before jabbing his hand into the water as another hand, a giant hand, rose up around Harry and caught him in its grip. The flames burned around Harry, pushing back against the watery grip, trying to keep it away from Harry's body. But slowly they were losing. His wand rising, its tip glowing green, he sneered. Now, Potter, it ends. Harry's eyes widened and he pushed harder, desperately, against the enclosing grip trapping him in place. Only, it wasn't enough. He could see he wouldn't be free in quite enough time. And then Voldemort screamed in pain. His wand dropping and his hand jerking out of the water, pulling Harry down for a moment before the grip was released. Both his hands went towards his back as he turned around. Harry stared in astonishment at the knife hilt sticking out of Voldemort's back. He raised his eyes and followed Voldemort's disbelieving stare. There, standing waist deep in the water, arms still extended, stood a trembling Bellatrix Black. Go to hell, you bastard, she said in a voice that echoed around the empty cave. He raised his hands as if to attack her, only suddenly a blast of air drove the knife in his back until it pierced out of his chest. With it, Harry's voice spoke up in agreement. Better yet, enjoy your new hell, Riddle. He hovered there a moment longer before collapsing down into the lake. His blood swiftly spread, forming a murky cloud of crimson beneath the surface. A moment later an unnatural black mist began to rise out of his body. Oh, no, you're not going anywhere, Harry stated with a snarl, gesturing towards the mist, throwing out a cage of white light, like glowing panes of glass connected at its corners by stars. This it's your eternity, your immortality, Riddle. This will be your hell until you welcome death. He gestured to the ceiling, where it opened like a blossoming flower, revealing a chunk of quartz. As the essence of Voldemort was captured by Harry's cage, it struggled violently against its prison. He could almost hear Voldemort wailing as the cage carried its prisoner up to the quartz and then into it. A moment later the stone close to again, trapping the quartz, the prison, and Voldemort, in darkness. Harry then turned and looked at Bellatrix. Didn't I tell you to stay down there? You're welcome. Bellatrix stated flatly as she glared at him with narrowed eyes. Thank you, Harry stated with a roll of his eyes before pausing and arching a brow. Wait, where did you get that knife? Bellatrix turned her head towards the body of her aunt. Harry could see where her robes had been slightly opened and quickly turned his face away, suppressing the sudden pulse of nausea he felt the back of his throat. When he looked back at Bellatrix, he wore a grimace of distaste. Couldn't you have just told me that? I could have gone without seeing that, Harry half complained as he focused on the earth beneath his feet and slowly pulled out a walkway towards his tunnel. You only had to look for a moment, Bellatrix stated with a grimace. I had to be the one to actually search inside. Harry sighed and shook his head before raising the stone beneath Bellatrix and his feet up and out of the water. With a gesture, a spark of fire began to slowly circle around her, spreading its warmth into her wet, thinly dressed body. Here, Harry gestured with his wand, summoning forth a simple black robe and then lightly tossing it to Bellatrix. I think it would be best if you put on something more. She clutched at the robe, holding for a moment, before slowly pulling it on as she affixed him with a look. Oh, now I have something you want to see. For a moment he just glanced at her before he then let out a bitter chuckle. I never thought you were unattractive, Ms. Black. I simply look at more than just a woman's beauty. She shook her head. She felt, well, tired. Everything that she had been through, everything she had experienced in the last few minutes, all of it suddenly slammed into her at once. The Imperious, her aunt, the Knights of Walpurgis, their words, their actions, their spells, their intentions. The way she had felt so absolutely, completely helpless. The way they toyed with her, the way they made her completely humiliate herself for their amusement. She remembered those things and the way she'd gone from uncaring bliss, the horrified realization. How many people have you seen something like this happen to? She asked, her voice barely a whisper as she stared down at her feet. Something like what? He asked curiously as he gave her a look with his head tilted to the side. You know what, she stated firmly. He paused for a moment before shrugging his shoulders. To be humiliated. To be treated as and made to feel like you're less than human. To be tortured by someone who was just looking for an excuse to be a sadist. Yes, she agreed softly looking to the side, staring at the dark water. That was me, Growing up, Harry stated simply. There was always someone who wanted me to think I was worthless, that I only deserved scorn and ridicule. There was always someone decided they could treat me like a thing because of my birth, my family, or the things I could do. Oh, she stated as a horrifying revelation hit her. Oh. Yes, he agreed with a thin smile. Oh, see, Bellatrix half whispered before taking a slow deep breath. Do you hate me? Harry sighed and shook his head. No, Ms. Black, I don't hate you. I have seen entirely too much hate to willingly invest in it myself. I have seen what hate does to men. I want no part in that. She looked at him, finally. Her eyes were dark, glistening with unshed tears. I didn't want to be like that. I just wanted to fight. To prove myself, that I was worthy, that I was more than just a pretty pureblood bride. Then, Ms. Black, exactly what did you think would happen in that pub where we first met? He stated, pausing, slowly turning around and affixing her with a look. How exactly did you figure that attacking a group of unarmed muggles was going to be a fight? They only told us that there would be violence and we would have a chance to prove that we were the purebloods. Bellatrix stated as she looked at his lips instead of his eyes. And you thought, what? That it would be some kind of tournaments, perhaps. An underground dueling ring. Maybe a cage match, between yourself and some helpless muggleborn. He asked the questions with a tough point, pressing her with his words as he stared back at her with cold, hard eyes. I didn't think, she admitted, her whole body slumping. I just wanted something, anything, to make me feel like I mattered. I had already been sold off to Lestrange. She paused there for a moment before shaking her head. No, that's not right. I had been expected to marry a pureblood. I had been required to marry a pureblood. He was someone my family accepted, someone they found to be a proper pureblood. To be honest, I didn't even care for him. Her shoulders rose and fell in a shrug. I remember that night, when I realized that he was dead. That I would not be marrying him. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel the elation. I didn't feel relief. I felt nothing. He had meant nothing to my life. Instead, I felt the horrified fascination with you. She looked away, staring out into the darkness, her eyes unfocused, looking not at the scene in front of her but deep into her memories. I remembered the violence, how grand and impressive it seemed. I remember then how much it fascinated me. How easily it came to you. No remorse, no restraint, no hesitation. And I've realized how much I wanted. Shoulders slumped, she began to chuckle bitterly. And I thought it was the violence that freed you. I thought it was the violence that would free me. Harry was silent for a long moment before calmly responding, it probably would have, but it would have left you a very unpleasant person. And eventually it would have led to you doing to others what was done to you tonight, and worse. She shuddered, nodding her head faintly as she looked down at the wet stone ground. I know. You knew. You saw it, didn't you? You saw what kind of monster I could have become. He pursed his lips and tilted his head to the side. I don't think it really matters. All I can really say is that I think you were ignorant. It wasn't the violence that freed me. In fact, in a lot of ways it holds me back. What frees me? I can't say it's a lack of fear, because I still know fear. No, what frees me is looking at that fear and understanding that it can't hold me back, that it doesn't control me. I am who I choose to be. Flaws, faults, failings. I'm not perfect. He looked pensive for a moment. I don't know how else to describe it. I am me, and I know no one can change that but me. Slowly she looked up from the ground and looked at him with cloudy eyes, a frown tugging at her lips. But what about expectations? Traditions? What about them? He shrugged in a loud brief smile on his face. I lived with the expectations that I was bound to be either Merlin reborn or a horrible dark lord in the making. Often from the same people. Traditions. The good ones can be nice if done for the right reasons. The ones that are done just because they're tradition. You should follow a tradition because you want to, because you respect it. Doing something just because others did. He snorted and shook his head as he gestured with his wand to the wall, and the walls seemed to melt down, revealing a tunnel. Traditions start for a reason. As long as that reason is still valid, there's still a reason to follow it. Though, if that reason is just hate, sadism, and self-superiority, well, You don't consider those valid reasons. Bellatrix pointed out with a shrug of her shoulders. After tonight, I can't say I particularly do either. Then, perhaps there's hope for you yet. Harry noted with a nod of his head. He escorted Bellatrix back to the door of her parents' home and then swiftly vanished to Hogsmeade. He appeared before the three broomsticks and walked inside. Madame Rosmerta smiled when she saw him, shifting her hips slightly to the side as her lips revealed the flash of white teeth. Well, welcome back, Professor Potter. Get your business taken care of, she asked before pausing and frowning. You vanished so quickly, I didn't even get the chance to say hello to you earlier. Seems to be the day for people vanishing. I could have sworn Bellatrix Black was here, but I can't seem to find any record of her. Business is all taken care of, yes, Harry agreed with a nod of his head. Then he winced as he listened to the rest of her statement. I'd advise you to talk to the mind healers then, because Bellatrix Black was kidnapped under the Imperius. Someone might have done something to you too. She paled, her hands rising up to her mouth. That poor girl, I hope she'll be okay. I imagine she'll be fine. She was fortunate enough to have her trouble intersect with my business, Harry stated with a slight shrug of his shoulders. Now, I apologize, but I need to use your flow. I left the headmaster rather anxious and I'm sure he's eager to hear from me. Oh, of course, she stated with a nod of her head. You know where to find it. Thank you, he said, before slowly walking over to her fireplace and grasping hold of a handful of flow powder. Hogwarts, headmaster's office. As he spoke the words, the powder ignited in the flames, turning them a flickering green. There is a moment where there was nothing but flickering flames. Then Dumbledore's face appeared, his features looking both curious and expectant. Professor Potter, I take it that your business is done. Harry grimaced for a moment, before nodding his head. I suppose you could say that. It turned out to be more involved than I thought it would. If you don't mind, I'd prefer if you let me through, and perhaps invited over Mr. Moody. Why, Professor Potter, do I have a great feeling of trepidation? The headmaster asked with a sigh. Very well, I will reach out Alistair. Harry turned his head, giving Rosmerta one more nod, before vanishing in a flash of flame. When he reappeared in Dumbledore's office, the headmaster was able to get a full view of Harry's current state. Where Rosmerta had missed most of the small, subtle little signs of his ordeal, Dumbledore caught them with only a glance. Harry watched the man frown, then affixed him with a piercing look. I have to say, Professor Potter, I am not accustomed to having my professors return from their outings showing every indication that they managed to find themselves in a bit of a scuffle. I do hope this isn't going to be a habit of yours, Dumbledore noted with a slightly distressed voice. I believe I'll find it very, trying to continue to explain away a common recurrence like that. Things ended up being more. Harry paused for a moment trying to find the right words. Involved than I thought they would be. Indeed? Dumbledore asked, his brow arching up slightly. I'm in bad need of a drink, Harry stated flatly as he shook his head. What I encountered, let's just say it's not the most encouraging of things. Though there is some good news to go with. And now I feel a swell of trepidation. Must you, Professor Potter? Dumbledore asked as he looked at the man. I am, alas, an old man. I can only take so many surprises. All I figured was I'd tell you first as you are technically my employer, Harry stated blandly as he shook his head. And I was, technically, acting during my working hours. I feel a great swell of esteem knowing that you place such high regard on my position. Dumbledore stated dryly and lifted the bowl of candies in front of him towards Harry. Lemo, sherbet while we wait. No, thank you. Though as I said, I wouldn't say no to a drink. Especially some whiskey, Harry stated with a sigh. I'm already quite tired. I've always found fighting tends to be a most strenuous activity, Dumbledore noted before flash of green flame announced the arrival of Alistair Moody. But as the esteemed Mr. Moody has arrived, please, do enlighten us, what was all this about? I'd rather know exactly why I suddenly got a message from Albus right before my bloody shift is over, with an allusion to what's likely going to be a nightmare worth of paperwork for me. So, what's going on? I discovered him a location of significance to Voldemort several months ago. He hadn't done anything at the time, At least not there. So I left an alarm ward behind along with a secret entrance. Earlier today the alarm was tripped. It was only supposed to activate after any wizards had arrived to then left, so imagine my surprise when I showed up to find them in full revel. Voldemort sitting back and watching as his followers tortured and beat Ms. Bellatrix Black. Harry let those words sink in as he sat back in his chair. And, of course, the bastard had up anti-port key and apparition wards. That put me in a very particular position. The girl? Alistair asked with narrowed eyes. With her parents, Harry answered with a shrug of his shoulders. After everything, I figure that would be the best place. What about the Aurors? Alistair demanded. More importantly, what about the healers? Dumbledore asked as he shot Alistair a look of disapproval. I left it up to her how she wanted to do things, Harry stated simply and shrugged his shoulders. She thought her family more appropriate. He tilted his head to the side, and gave them both a look. I wonder why that is. Alistair Moody took a slow deep breath, before looking back at Harry. I'm going to need a statement from her. Why? Harry asked blandly as he continued to sit tiredly in his seat. Don't think there's anything you need to worry about anymore. At least why are they concerned? Dumbledore closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow deep breath. Do I want to know what you did? I wasn't the one who killed most of them, Harry stated shaking his head. Voldemort's blood Gorger saw to that. And it's why I really want to drink right now. Dumbledore went still while Alistair just looked confused. What the bloody hell is that? An anti-army blood curse, Dumbledore stated in a faint half-disbelieving voice. One considered a war crime in the civilized world. It is one of the few spells I wholeheartedly support the annihilation of any and all reference to and of. Alistair stared at Dumbledore, his mouth half opening as his brows rose up his face. What the bloody hell is so horrible about it? If used right? Harry asked, a shudder running down his spine as he again recalled his previous experiences with the spell. They can use a mosquito to kill an army. The blood Gorger contaminates any blood he comes in contact with. It uses that blood to power itself, and takes control of it, Dumbledore stated with a quiet voice, his eyes affixed to Harry. Contamination is almost instantaneous. Typically the blood is then ripped out of the victim's body and used it to attack everyone else around it. Continually feeding itself new victims, growing in size, growing in power. Yeah, I was lucky, Harry agreed with a nod of his head as he shuddered again. The bastard knew how to use it, but he didn't have the creativity to make it as dangerous as it could have been. Still, he did use his followers to power the whole bloody thing. Even the ones who weren't even hurt. Warily he looked at the two. That place is a graveyard now. I'd suggest you leave it as such. And Voldemort? Dumbledore asked intently. What of him? I left him with his precious immortality, Harry stated as he looked up and stared into Dumbledore's eyes. Since he valued it above everything else, I figured he wouldn't mind paying with his life, his body, his freedom, and his mind. Dumbledore blanched slightly, his face pale as he looked at Harry. Then he is trapped and unable to escape, Harry added flatly. Where only I know where he can be found, primarily thanks to his own ward work. What the bloody hell are you two talking about? Alistair demanded. Old Tom, well, he decided he was going to cheat death, Harry stated as he looked at Dumbledore. And he thought he found the perfect way to do it. Split his soul, attaching to artifacts so valuable that he thought no one would consider destroying them. Only he didn't think about why it is no one uses them, beyond the fact that you're tearing your soul. It is an abomination, Dumbledore stated with a shake of his head. It denies you your ability to move on. You are trapped between life and death, unable to move one way or the other. A miserable existence. So, you're saying that all the attacks are going to stop, but you won't give me any proof of it. And in the next few days, I'm going to find out that another group of fine, upstanding purebloods are reported missing and they're never going to be found. Alistair stated slowly. And just like that, the Knights of Walpurgis are gone. Alistair just stared at Harry. Does this mean that I can assure Minerva that your lessons will become more acceptable? Dumbledore asked as he tried to change the subject. I think not, Harry stated with a shake of his head, but you can assure her that I will be staying no more than 7 years. Just long enough for a single class? Dumbledore asked, sounding slightly disappointed. 7 years to determine if what I'm teaching has any value or not. After all, if it doesn't, then Minerva will have proven her point, now, won't she? Harry noted with a tired sigh. Now, if you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I'm going to my room. I'm going to have a drink and an early night so I can pick up first thing in the morning and try to get some actual teaching done. A few moments after Harry left, Alistair turned to Dumbledore and stated bluntly, Albus. That boy scares me. I find myself rather uneasy with him, to be honest, Dumbledore admitted with a faint shrug of his shoulders. You find yourself uneasy because he's a warrior, Alistair stated matter-of-factly. He scares me because he gave that report like I would after catching some fresh out of Hogwarts idiot muggle baiting. Dumbledore blinked a moment, then slowly nodded. Because he speaks with a familiarity bordering on weariness. Because he's so bloody familiar with KS like this that they don't surprise him, and he knows to keep his mouth shut about things that could cause problems down the line, Alistair stated flatly. Since only he knows where to find that bastard, only he can get him back out and only he can reveal the information to someone else. Ah, and that means it is unlikely to be coerced out of him, Dumbledore agreed with a vague nod of his head. Alistair looked at him for a moment, before sighing and shaking his head. I'm going back to the ministry, Albus. Then I will be heading to have a few words with Ms. Black to have her corroborate Mr. Potter's story. In the meantime, I would consider you keep a watchful eye on your young professor. If I might ask why? Dumbledore asked in confusion. The Auror paused for a moment, as if weighing the words before shrugging his shoulders. Because he's either a confrigo waiting to go off or a man who has a lot of things to teach. With that, Alistair Moody nodded his head towards Dumbledore and moved back to the flow, leaving the headmaster to sit in his chair in quiet contemplation. Maeve's tits, Bellatrix. What in Merlin's name happened to you? Cygnus Black demanded as he saw his eldest daughter enter their home, clinging to a robe with a quiet death grip, and immediately made his way towards her. She only flinched a bit when he reached for her, but it was enough to give him pause as he looked at her with suddenly furious eyes. Daughter, what's been done to you? Bellatrix flinched again at his gaze and hung her head as she stared at the floor, trying to organize her thoughts. The jumble of words that poured out of her lips left him confused and angry as a dangerous look crossed his eyes, forcing him to take a slow, deep breath to force himself to calm. Bellatrix. Daughter. Try to calm yourself, please. Just tell me what happened, he asked as calmly as he could, his frustrations churning through his veins. I went to try to seduce the storm chaser again. And, again, I was turned away. He said things I didn't want to hear about why he had no interest in me. Things that angered me, confused me, I felt so lost. Cygnus' lips pressed angrily into a hard thin line. Was he the one that? Merlin, no. Bellatrix quickly shook her head, grabbing hold of him with a tight, desperate grip. I went for a drink, and then I was put under the Imperius. He beeped in a breath at that, his eyes going wide, before narrowing into flinty chips. Who dares? The Lord of the Knights of Walpurgis, Bellatrix told him as the memory rose unbidden, that horribly pleasant memory of feeling absolutely happy to do whatever she was told. He had me strip. Then dressed me in. She paused a moment, before lifting her arm out enough from the robe to show the translucent nothing underneath. Then he made me collar myself. And cuff myself. Every word seemed to fuel a fire inside of her father, a rage unlike nothing she had ever imagined. Her whole life, her father's temper had always been cool, controlled. A razor, sharp and ready to cut where it was directed. But this was like a volcano, wanting desperately to explode and burn everything in its path. Still, she had already faced worse than this tonight. A part of her firmed and as she stood up straighter at that and looked her father in the eyes. After that he released me from the spell and then told his followers they could do whatever they wanted to with me. She could almost hear the creaking of his bones as his fingers clenched back into his palm as his body began to tremble in fury. Then he froze when he heard what she said next. Aunt Walburga was with them. She was with them. What? Cygnus growled out the word as he struggled to come to grips with the concept that his sister, would help do such a thing to his daughter. They only started with the torture. Calling me things, promising more, and then, suddenly, they were screaming. Cygnus stared at her, dumbfounded for a moment as he realized. What? The storm chaser found them, she stated simply as she shrugged her shoulders a bit. He found them, he started to fight them. All of them. He killed her so toughly, and then their lord, he killed them all. All his followers, he just ripped the blood out of their veins just to power some kind of spell to use against the storm chaser. For a moment, Cygnus said nothing, before finally he spoke again. Then, is it over? She nodded her head quietly. He finished it. They're all dead. All of them. The last bit was more to herself as she recalled the horrid thing that escaped the fallen Voldemort's body. Unfortunately, without all the Horcruxes destroyed, Cygnus stated with a slow sigh of anger still smoldering in his voice. He caught him, Bellatrix stated quietly. I saw it, when he died. It rose out of his body it was almost like smoke, but so very wrong. Cygnus nodded slightly as her description watched what he had read about the death of a Horcrux-bound wizard. Caught him. That wasn't something he'd heard about before, but he had to admit that, with every other impossibility he'd faced lately, it sounded like it could be plausible. It was like he created a cage for it. It was trapped. Then he made the roof of the cave blossom to show some kind of crystal. A moment later, he had the cage somehow merge with the crystal, trapping him there. Then the hole then was swallowed up again. Where? Cygnus asked, almost demanding it. She opened her mouth to answer before freezing and slowly shaking her head. I don't know. I was taken there, and he took me back, here. He grimaced a bit and then nodded. I suppose that means that it's unlikely to be discovered. Yes, Bellatrix agreed with a slow nod of her head. Then suddenly she was engulfed in his arms as he pulled her to his chest. For a moment she tensed in confusion before slowly relaxing as she buried her face into his chest. She could hear his voice, quiet against her ear. I am so sorry, daughter. I am so very sorry. Bellatrix just held onto him, her eyes glistening with tears as she finally allowed herself to break down into sobs in his arms. Harry awoke bleary-eyed with a bone-deep ache in his body that left him hissing in discomfort. And that was discounting the pounding throb in his head from his hangover. Sighing softly, he allowed himself a moment to try and simply will the pain away, hoping that the comfort of his bed would allow him to ignore it. When it failed to abate, he sighed tiredly and slowly rose up out of his bed and blearily searched out his glasses. He was going to have a class to teach today, which meant he would need to recover enough to fulfill his responsibilities. You look like shit. He froze a moment, before pulling his glasses up onto his head to see Charles and Lucius Potter standing there, watching him expectantly. Yes, well, I had a shit day yesterday. Harry stated blandly before shaking his head. But at least it was worse for that bastard Riddle. It's truly done then? Lucius asked as he cautiously watched Harry. Sighing, Harry nodded his head. Yes, it's done. Bloody bastard used a Merlin-damned army killer curse, but it's done. Lucius blanched slightly at the statement. Army killers were practically unheard of outside of use against actual armies. He went that far. Blood gorgle, Harry stated flatly as he involuntarily shuddered again. Used it against his own bloody people to power it up to use against me. Seeing the looks of incomprehension on their faces, Harry sighed. It's a blood curse. If it connects with your blood, it spreads to it, and generally the caster will then just rip it out of your body. It uses the blood both as attack and as fuel. Nasty, nasty curse. Both Elder Potters grimaced at the description. But, you are well. As well as can be expected for a man who just fought like a bloody damned idiot and then got drunk last night on top of it. Harry stated with a grunt and a grimace. I really don't like dealing with fights like that, but I didn't have much choice in the matter. You won. Charles pointed out to him. Barely, Harry corrected with a sigh before looking at the two men. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to get changed, take a shower and get dressed. Thank you for saving Bellatrix. Charles spoke up suddenly as he looked at Harry. I know you didn't have to. Yes, I did. Harry corrected with a shake of his head and a grunt as he pushed up his glasses, then rubbed his eyes. Just leaving her like that would have meant she would have died or been broken. I've seen too many people suffer through things like that. You're a good man, Lucius stated sincerely. We'll talk to you after you're finished with your preparations for the day. Thank you, Harry stated simply as he walked towards his shower while the two men saw themselves out. When he finished, he exited his room, dressed in a fresh set of robes and finding the two Potters talking quietly with a third. Young James Potter, to be precise. Professor Potter, James stated with a bright earnestness that made Harry almost twitch slightly. Mr. Potter, Harry acknowledged with a nod of his head. Charles, Lucius. James was just telling us about the classes you've been giving. Lucius noted with a slight smile on his face. A game, was it? Harry shrugged his shoulders. They are still children, and far more likely to invest themselves in something they enjoy after all. Quite, Charles agreed with a nod and a small smile. James seems to be quite energetic about it, though he seems disappointed you're not teaching grand and arcane magics. Cousin. James whined slightly as he looked at Charles with a face lined by betrayal. I'm sure. Harry agreed with a nod of his head as he gave James a look. Magics which I already informed him that I will not be teaching him. James's expression took on a look of sulky irritation at the declaration while Lucius chuckled softly. I see. For the best, I'd imagine. Merlin knows what kind of trouble James would get up to if he had access to such things. I can most assuredly imagine, Harry stated dryly as he gave James a look, watching the boy blush brightly and cringe back down. Fortunately, he's managed to refrain from his antics in my class. Well, yeah, James admitted with a shrug. You're scarier than McGonagall. I'm sure she'll be ecstatic to hear that. Harry drawled before giving James a look. Now, I believe you have breakfast to get to. But, James started to protest, only to have a look from Harry, Lucius and Charles send him off with another sulky mutter. He's enthusiastic and stubborn, I'll give him that, Harry noted with a faint smile, but I imagine you were here for more than an update on James's behavior. Minerva McGonagall already gave me a report. Lucius stated with a grimace. I swear that boy is more trouble than, how do you manage to keep him behaved? Creativity, Harry stated simply with a faint tug of his lips. After all, everyone else will only take off points and or give him detention. He knows I am far more creative than that, and that he will not enjoy whatever punishment it is I inflict upon him. I presume you have heard about Andromeda Black's fate. Harry smiled at the snort Charles gave. Yes, my nephew has made it abundantly clear how much his daughter dislikes the honor you gave her. And he finds it amusingly ironic. Using rewards to punish. Yes, well, I did do much the same to young Sirius. Harry noted with a faint chuckle. His example made James realize that I am not one to be crossed. McGonagall is convinced that the only reason you can keep my incorrigible little menace to behave is because I am enforcing your discipline. Lucius noted, his lips twitching in faint amusement. She refuses to believe that I have no part in it at all. Yes, she tends to view me with a less than admirable gaze, Harry stated with a faint shrug of his shoulders. The fact that I make my classes quite interactive seems to have her believing I am a reckless deviant destined to send all of my students to St. Mungo's long-term treatment ward. I gathered. Lucius agreed with a nod of his head and a smile before his face grew serious. But, I must ask, the issue is resolved. As resolved as it's going to be, Harry admitted with a sigh. There are still several of his Horcruxes left to find, but the man himself is dealt with. That is something of a relief, Charles noted with a faint sigh and a shake of his head. I had been worried. You should still be worried, Harry admitted with a grunt and a shake of his head. At least one of those items can possess people. I don't want that damn thing to fall into anyone's hands, but I don't know where it could be. What else is there? Lucius asked with a sigh. Will we never be rid of this monster? At least a diary, Harry stated with a purse of his lips. Potentially a locket, and potentially a chalice. No point in alarming them just yet. And you were able to remove the one in the school already? Charles asked with a penetrating look in his eyes. Yes, Harry agreed with a nod of his head. Dumbledore can attest to it. So you did bring him in after all. Lucius murmured softly as his eyes grew distant. I had wondered. I had to make sure that I wasn't stumbling over him when I was acting. Didn't leave me much choice in the matter. Harry responded, pausing a moment before continuing. He is a good man. Too idealistic and kind, but still he means well. He just has trouble comprehending that good intentions and desires to help can cause more damage than they prevent at times. Very well, we'll take your word for it, Charles stated with a nod of his head. Though I will thank you for saving my grand-niece. She and her family do send their regards. Harry stiffened for a moment, before sighing. I suppose they know what I did to Sirius, mother then. Yes. There was a sigh as Charles nodded his head sadly. It wasn't unexpected. And Sirius had been told to expect such a thing. Still, his family is gathering him, Andromeda and young Mr. Tonks now to let them know what's happened. Right. There was a nod of his head before he affixed them both with a look. I'm not taking you to the cave. There was a slight look of disappointment in Lucius' eyes. I thought not, but there was a chance. I don't want to take the chance of anyone finding him. Harry stated simply with a shake of his head. Not as long as I'm around. Very well then. Lucius cut off anything Charles was going to say with a look. What? I wasn't going to argue. Charles protested with his hands raised up. Even if it does sound like it would be a rather intriguing place to see. No. Harry stated flatly. Well, I suppose I tried. Charles agreed with a sigh. Sirius stood stiffly in the headmaster's office as he waited for his cousin to arrive. Next to him his father sat with a resolute face carved as if from stone. Across from them, Albus Dumbledore looked. Well, Sirius wasn't sure how the man looked. But it was not the look of a man who was in the least bit happy. So, Sirius leaned back in his seat, trying to remain as still as possible. He didn't want to upset his father. Not with how angry the man looked. And Uncle Cygnus didn't look much better, though his emotions looked more subdued and sad than anything. Sirius wasn't quite sure why, but he was sure it was important. Then his cousin was there, along with Ted. Fortunately, it didn't look like they'd been snogging. Though, typically it was still a bit early in the day for them to be doing that. He still took a great deal of pleasure in tracking them down, if only to find the right hiding spots that the prefects never seemed to check. Father, Uncle, what's this about? Andromeda asked, her hand having reflexively sought out Ted's when she saw the looks on the two brother-in-law's faces. I can take my leave if you'd prefer, Dumbledore spoke up softly as he looked at them. This is a family matter after all. You know what this is about. Orion made sure to not word it as a question as he stared at Dumbledore. After what happened last night, I can surmise. Dumbledore admitted with a sigh. Terrible bit of business. Terrible. Quite. Orion stated with a succinct hiss of breath. I will take my leave then, Dumbledore stated before looking to his perch. Fox. The headmaster's phoenix ruffled his feathers and then gave the headmaster a look, before promptly ignoring him as he began to sing. Slowly the tension drained out of the office's atmosphere and Dumbledore managed a faint smile. Very well, I suppose it might be beneficial for you to stay after all. Fox simply chirped back at him as he settled back onto his post after his song faded. Once the headmaster had gone, Orion looked from Andromeda to Ted, and then almost reluctantly to Sirius. For a moment there was nothing but silence as the man seemed to debate exactly what to say. Finally, it was broken by an impatient chirp from the phoenix, as if to tell Orion to get on with it already. Casting the bird a slightly rebuking look, Orion then turned back to Sirius and sighed. Yesterday Bellatrix was put under the Imperius by the Lord of the Knights of Walpurgis and kidnapped. Andromeda gasped loudly, her eyes wide and shocked while Ted quickly held onto her shoulders. Sirius himself looked surprised, and then worried. But, that didn't explain the look on his father's face. She was taken to a cave, where she was put through a very unpleasant experience. Orion struggled to state exactly what had been done to Bellatrix, glancing towards Sirius and Andromeda, before shaking his head. Very unpleasant. But thankfully not permanent. He took a slow deep breath. Unfortunately, Walburga was with them. And chose to help them instead of Bellatrix. Andromeda gasped lightly as she clutched tightly at Ted's hand. Sirius frowned slightly but didn't show any other reaction. Orion. Orion wished he could tell himself to be disappointed with his son's lack of reaction, but the fact that his son wasn't surprised at his mother's actions hit home hard. She's dead, isn't she? Sirius more stated it than asked it as he sat in his chair, looking at his father rather pointedly. Did Bellatrix kill her? No, Bellatrix did not kill her, Cygnus answered, though he did not dispute that she had not survived. She was rescued. Does this have to do with why the storm chaser left his classes behind yesterday? Andromeda asked as she looked from her father to her uncle while Ted stayed quiet next to her. As it stands, yes, Orion agreed with a reluctant sigh. He managed to rescue her. But they were the only survivors. And he killed Mother. Sirius stated simply, his face unreadable as he leaned back in his seat. Cyrus, Orion started to say, reaching out and placing a hand on his son's shoulder. What? You say it like you weren't expecting it. Sirius stated quietly and shrugged his shoulders a bit. The rest of the blacks all turned and looked at him with a horrified shock as he shrank back under their gazes. Why don't you explain to them why you think that, kid? Ted offered Sirius as the boys seemed to squirm and shrink under their gazes. Well, it was Mother. Don't you remember how much she tried to say we needed to kill the storm chaser? Sirius stated quietly as he looked down at his hands. After she got thrown out, who did you think she was going to go to? What did you think she was going to try? The rest of them froze at that, before they slowly looked at each other and then back at Sirius. I thought it was obvious. I mean, we all saw Bellatrix's memory. You showed him. Andromeda hissed as she glared at her uncle. Orion shrugged his shoulders a bit and sighed. He is my heir, and insisted. It was his choice. He wasn't even in Hogwarts at the time. Andromeda protested. It's fine, Sirius stated quietly, shaking his head. It stopped Father from being like Mother. I needed to know why. It's not fine. Andromeda insisted with a growl. It should never be fine. That memory was of a slaughter. No child should see that. Rom. Ted's voice was a soft but firm rebuke. Look at Sirius. Unwillingly, she did as she was told, turning her head to look at her young cousin, only to see in the eyes looking back at her a sharp steel in his gray eyes, one that wouldn't back down, wouldn't flinch away. Maybe it was stupid of me, maybe it was selfish of me, Sirius agreed quietly as he stared down at his hands, his voice soft, listless. But I had to know. Otherwise, you were all going to hate me. I would never. Andromeda quickly protested and Sirius winced a bit and nodded. Sorry, Rometa. I meant, Father, Uncle, Mother, Aunt, everyone else in the family except maybe Uncle Alfred, Sirius amended quickly and shook his head, smiled a bit at her. I don't see the point of all the hate. I don't want to just go around hurting people for something they never did to me. What does it matter to me who someone's parents are? They aren't them. Just like I'm not my parents. I can get hurting someone because they were trying to hurt you or someone you knew, but. There was a pause and he shrugged quietly. That's not really what you were talking about, was it? Oh, Sirius, Andromeda sighed as she got up and walked over to her cousin, giving him a quick hug. He smiled faintly at her. Thanks, Rometa. It was what it was. Orion frowned as his son refused to look at him before sighing softly. He wanted to say he would never have turned on his son like that. That if the boy had been in Gryffindor and not followed in his own footsteps that he wouldn't have treated him any differently. But he wasn't so sure he'd have been able to. Losing Sirius wouldn't have been the danger that facing the storm chaser would have. Having Sirius rebel would have been disheartening, disappointing, but not world-shattering like what they had experienced. He wondered if that was just another sign of just how mad everything about who they had been before all this. So he didn't try to deny it. He didn't dispute his son's statement. Instead, he simply set his hand down on his shoulder and gave it a soft squeeze. Then he looked towards Cygnus. Cygnus sat there, his eyes half closed as he slumped back in his seat, looking as if the world itself had suddenly become something he no longer recognized. A man lost in the things he was realizing and wondering exactly where he would go from there. The sheer lack of surprise or grief in Sirius shook him deeper than he would have thought. It's funny, Ted stated quietly as he watched Andromeda try to comfort Sirius. We look at the world, where we think we're going, how it works, what we're going to expect, and then it throws something at you and makes you realize that you never really knew half as much as you thought you did. Slowly opening his eyes, Cygnus would give a faint nod of his head as he studied the young man who would become his son-in-law. The boy was an odd one. Always relaxed, almost appearing lazy, with an easy grin and an amiable personality. But he had heart. The scars on his back proved that. And the way he'd saved Bellatrix proved he had both intelligence, cunning and power. And he had a bloody point. Who would have expected that he'd be welcoming a Muggleborn to join their house and marry his daughter? The whole world had gone mad. As he sat there, considering just where it had led his sister when she had refused to change with it and his fist clenched. Perhaps it had been best that they had gone mad with it. At least this way they were still a family. Well, things certainly took an interesting turn, Charles Potter noted as he sat quietly in his chair, sipping at his scotch. You say interesting, I say maddening. Cygnus Black responded with a half glower as he leaned back in his seat. What are you complaining about? Charles asked with an arched brow. The Blacks are more influential than they've been in generations. And looking to be more plentiful as well. Must you remind me, Uncle? Cygnus half whined as he shook his head. After everything, Bellatrix is still enamored with that blasted storm chaser. She ignores her responsibilities, rejects all suitors and spends her time doting on the man. Are you upset that she's doting on him, or that after so many years he's finally starting to come around to her attentions? Charles countered back with a bemused smirk on his face. I still can hardly believe it's been 7 years now. Cygnus released a heavy sigh and a shake of his head as he slumped back in his seat. And that I am a grandfather already. Grandfather of a metamorphagus, Charles reminded him. Twice over in fact. Yes, well young Cassiopeia and Antares are looking to already cause enough trouble for Andromeda. Cygnus allowed a faint smile to curl over his lips. Adorable little rascals. Yes, quite, Charles agreed with a faintly amused smile. Are you still trying to talk Lucius into betrothing James to Narcissa? It would be a good match. Cygnus defended as he raised his chin. And I'd like to have at least one member of this generation involved with a pureblood for a change. Still upset about Sirius' engagement to the Evans girl, Charles teased casually with a triumphant smirk. I should think she proved more than up to the task. Head girl and a remarkable head on her shoulders for charms and potions. Yes, and the same damned eyes as the storm chaser. Cygnus shuddered softly. How he can look at them and not shudder is beyond me. I fail to see why you find Harry to be such a terrifying wizard after all these years. He hasn't done much of anything beyond teach since he finished dispatching that Voldemort pest. Charles responded with a shake of his head. Honestly, must you be so antagonistic with your likely son-in-law? You even get along with young Ted well enough. Ted is perfectly willing to let me bully and intimidate him, as a proper son-in-law should. Cygnus shot back with a glower. That blasted monster can tear me into pieces small enough to feed doxies without even breaking stride. Yes, but you can't deny that he isn't effective in how he trains his students. Charles smiled as he sipped his drink. And that seems to benefit our whole society. By the time they graduate they have a group of stalwart friends that they have already been through hell with. I know. I have to admit, I took a great deal of satisfaction watching the expression on dear Andromeda's face when she realized that she had trounced an entire squad of trained Aurors with her friends when they had gotten too rowdy in their celebrations. Cygnus agreed with a faint smile. Did Edgar Bones manage to forgive her? Charles asked with a bemused chuckle. Once he realized that he had even more to lose from it getting out that she not only outfought him, but outdrank him, he decided it was better to try and recruit her. Cygnus chuckled faintly. Andromeda still gets recruitment letters from the DMLE like clockwork. You would think having her husband would be enough. Charles pointed out, still smiling. Ted is entirely too laid back in his opinion. Andromeda is the vicious one. True enough. Charles laughed and nodded his head. Are you still disappointed the Malfoy family turned out to be so deficient? You mean am I still desiring their blood after that brat approached me for Narcissa's hand after it was painfully apparent that his father had been one of the bastards involved in the things done to Bellatrix? Cygnus countered back with a glare. I have accepted that your cousin is protecting the boy from paying for the sins of his father, but if that fool comes around here again. Yes, well, considering how it was enough to finally push Lucius to wash his hands of the whole thing, I'll count it as a win. Charles agreed with a nod of his head. I'm sure. Cygnus agreed with a nod of his head before pursing his lips thoughtfully. I suppose at this point all that's left is the future, waiting to see what it holds. And how many grandchildren you end up with to spoil. Charles stated teasingly. As long as they don't have those terrifying green eyes, Cygnus agreed, though, he hated to admit exactly how likely that was. Of course, nephew, of course. Charles agreed with a slight teasing to his voice. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.